The sky over Harlan County was the color of bleached bone, flat and merciless above the west field. 100 acres of coarse yellow grass lay still under the heat, the color of failure. No cloud moved. No rain had come in weeks. The land itself seemed to have stopped asking. A tall woman stood at the eastern fence line. Her shadow stretched long across the wrong-colored grass. She took one step, then another, shorter strides than her height wanted, each boot placed with deliberate caution on ground that felt too soft for drought. A low, almost inaudible sound rose from somewhere beneath her feet, the slow movement of water with no place to go. She reached into her coat and pulled out a letter. The creases were worn smooth from being opened and refolded in the small hours. 90 days. The words sat heavy in the still air. From the south pasture came 20 horses shifting restlessly in the heat. One iron-gray mare stood apart, watching the field with eyes that had learned not to trust the ground. The woman folded the letter and put it away. She turned and walked toward the barn. The morning of June 1st, 1879 came in hot and still. No wind, no cloud. Just sky the color of bleached bone stretching flat over Harlan County, Wyoming. Like the land itself had given up asking for rain weeks ago and stopped bothering to look. Clara Voss had been awake since 3. Not because she couldn't sleep, she could sleep. She'd learned to sleep through worse things than a bank letter. Through the winter, her father's cough started. Through the spring, the east field flooded. Through the October morning, they found him in his chair with his boots still on, and the sun already past the window, and everything wrong about. The quality of the silence in the house. She'd learned to sleep through all of that. But not this. Not the arithmetic. The arithmetic was the problem. The arithmetic was what woke her at 3 and kept her awake until the sky went from black to gray to this particular bone white that meant another day without rain was already underway. Because the arithmetic was the kind of problem that looked different at 3 in the morning than it did at noon, and she discovered over the past 6 weeks that the 3 in the morning version was the honest one. The noon version let you believe there were options you didn't actually have. She stood at the kitchen window with both hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and looked out at the west field, still dark at this hour, still flat, still the same 100 acres of coarse yellow grass and leaning fence posts and silence that it had been for 30 years. 30 years. 30 years of her father walking to the eastern edge of it in the morning and standing there looking at it the way you look at something you've done wrong and can't figure out how to fix. She'd watched him do it her whole life. Now she was the one watching. The letter from First Harlan Bank had arrived 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, in a cream-colored envelope addressed to Mr. August Voss, in handwriting that someone had then crossed out with a single careful line and replaced with Mrs. Clara Voss below it. As if the bank had prepared the letter before her father died and simply updated the recipient afterward. Which was probably exactly what had happened. She knew every word of that letter now. She'd read it enough times that the paper had gone soft at the folds. The kind of soft that happens to paper you've handled too much, touched too many times in the small hours of the night, hoping the words might have changed. They hadn't changed. Mrs. Clara Voss. Outstanding note, Voss Ranch, Parcel 14, Harlan County, Wyoming. As per the terms of the note executed by August Voss on March 14, 1872, and subsequently extended on 3 occasions, the outstanding balance of... She didn't need to read the number. She knew the number. She did the arithmetic with the number every night, 90 days. Full balance or forfeit. Her father had called the West Field his unfinished business. That was what he'd called it, not the dead ground. Not the problem field, not any of the names the rest of Harlan County used. His unfinished business. As if it were a letter he hadn't finished writing, or a conversation he'd stepped away from mid-sentence intending to come back. The rest of Harlan County had different names for it. Dead ground was the most common, because that's what it looked like. 100 acres of coarse yellow grass that didn't grow right and didn't drain right, and swallowed tools and broke axles and had defeated 3 separate attempts to work it into productive farmland over the past 30 years. You could stand at the eastern fence and look at it, and see clearly that something was wrong with it. The color was wrong. The texture was wrong. The way it felt under your boots was wrong. A strange heaviness to the earth that had nothing to do with the drought, baking everything else this summer, and everything to do with water that had nowhere to go. Water that had been sitting in the wrongs for 30 years. She'd read her father's journal 3 times through in the month since he died. Every entry, starting from 1851, when August Foss first broke ground on this ranch with a wagon, a mule, and an idea about bottom land that he'd gotten from a man he met on the road west. A man who'd told him that the richest soil in Wyoming was sitting underwater, and all it needed was someone patient enough to wait it out. He'd been patient. She'd give him that. She'd read the good years, 1854, when the Eastfield came in and they had more corn than they could sell, and had to store the surplus in every outbuilding on the property. 1861, when they expanded the barn. 1863, when Silas Breck came to put in the Eastfield drainage system, and the thing worked so well that her father wrote about it for 3 pages, describing each step of the process in the careful handwriting of a man recording something important for future reference. She'd read the bad years, too. 1867, when the creek changed course and the Westfield started holding water differently. 1869, when her father first tried to fix it and failed. 1871, when he tried again. 1873, when he tried a 3rd time. Lost a good horse in the mud, and the handwriting in the journal got smaller after that. Compressed, more careful, like a man learning to take up less space in his own life. She'd read the year her mother died, 1875. That year had very few entries, and she'd read the last entries, the ones near the back, written in a hand that had started to shake sometime in the past year, without anyone noticing or saying anything about it. Because you didn't say things like that to August Voss, 3 lines. That was what he'd left her. Drain line, West Creek Junction to Stone Bend, North Branch shallow, blocked. Westfield not dead, waiting. Silas Breck knows where to start. She'd read those 3 lines so many times in the past month that they had the quality of something memorized in childhood, present in the mind before the eyes find them on the page. Westfield not dead, waiting. She set the cold coffee down on the kitchen table. She pulled on her boots. The good ones, the ones her father had bought her 2 years ago when her old pair finally gave out. Wide enough for her feet and tall enough to account for her stride, which was longer than most people's strides, because she was taller than most people. Considerably taller. The kind of taller that had stopped being something she explained to people somewhere in her mid-20s and had become simply a fact about the physical world, like the height of the kitchen door frame, which she cleared by exactly 1 inch and navigated by habit rather than thought. 7 feet and 1 inch. That was how tall Clara Voss was. She had been this tall since she was 19, when she'd apparently finished growing. And the world had adjusted itself around her, the way the world adjusts around things it can't change. With a mixture of accommodation and ongoing surprise. She was 36 years old now. She had been a widow's daughter since October. She had been the sole owner of a ranch with a banknote she couldn't pay, and 100 acres of what everyone called dead ground, and she was going to fix that today, or start to fix it. She picked up the bank letter from the kitchen table, folded it once, put it in her coat pocket. Then she went outside to feed the horses. The morning air was already warm, which meant the afternoon would be brutal. The 6 horses in the south pasture moved to the fence when they heard her coming. Ruth first, the steady bay mare Clara rode. Then the 5 working horses her father had kept for the ranch. They were good horses. Patient, sound-legged, accustomed to the specific rhythms of this particular property. She fed them in the dark and thought about what she was about to do, not whether to do it. She'd settled that at 3 in the morning, or maybe she'd settled it the night she read those 3 lines in her father's journal for the first time and understood that he hadn't been recording a failure. He'd been leaving instructions. What she was thinking about was how. The drainage problem was one thing. She understood the drainage problem, or she understood it enough to know that she needed Silas Breck to understand the rest of it. The old ditch man. Her father's note had been clear about that. But before Silas, she needed something else. She needed names. And before names, she needed 90 days that were actually 90 days she could use. Not 90 days where the bank decided midway through that. The situation had changed and moved the deadline up. She needed Aldous Merritt to look at her and understand that she was not asking for anything except what the terms of the note already gave her. She gave Ruth an extra handful of grain. The mayor lifted her head and looked at her with those calm brown eyes that had, over the years of their association, developed the particular expression of an animal that has learned not to be surprised by the humans it lives with. "Don't look at me like that," Clara said. Ruth went back to eating. Clara picked up the bank letter from her coat pocket, held it for a moment, put it back. 90 days. She rode into town. The thing about being a woman who's 7 feet and 1 inch tall is that you stop expecting people to look at you, like you're normal somewhere around age 8. Clara had figured that out early. She'd been the tallest person in her schoolroom at 7. By 10, she'd grown out of every desk in Harlan County's one-room schoolhouse. And Miss Alderton had accommodated her by letting her sit at the teacher's table in the back, which was both a practical solution and a social catastrophe of the first order, because nothing marks a child as different, quite like sitting apart from everyone else on furniture that fits you differently. By 12, the top of the door frame was a problem she'd already learned to solve without thinking. Head down, shoulders angled, one smooth continuous motion. The way anyone learns to manage a low ceiling or a wet floor or any other feature of the built world that requires accommodation. You adapt. You stop noticing you're adapting until someone else's face reminds you. She got a lot of faces this morning. She rode into Harlan at just past 7 and tied Ruth at the post outside First Harlan Bank. Walked up the 2 steps to the door. Ducked, smooth, automatic. The motion of 36 years, and stepped inside. The floor was wood. Old planks, slightly uneven, the kind of floor that made sounds under everyone's weight, but made particular sounds under hers. Deeper, more deliberate, the sounds of someone built differently from the average customer of First Harlan Bank. On a Tuesday morning in June, every person in the room heard it. The teller, the man in the corner chair with his hat in his lap, the young clerk behind the side partition who'd been writing something and wasn't anymore. They all went still, not afraid, not hostile. Just the particular stillness of people who weren't this particular thing and needed a moment to rearrange their understanding of the morning around it. Clara had stopped letting that stillness bother her sometime in her mid-20s. Before that, it had bothered her considerably. She'd learned slowly that there was nothing to be done about it except wait for it to pass. It always passed. She walked to the main desk. The counter came to her hip, designed for people a foot shorter, which was most people, and she set the bank letter down on the surface and looked at the clerk. "Aldous Merritt," she said. "Please." Merritt came out from the back office 2 minutes later. He was 52. Well-dressed even at this hour. Collar buttoned, jacket pressed, the particular kind of put-together that announces something about a man. "I arrived here first, and I was ready before you arrived." It was a message she'd seen him deliver many times over the years. He was the kind of man who made sure his physical presentation was never the thing that needed explaining. He was not a tall man, 5 feet 8, maybe 5'9". He had to look up at Clara at an angle that most people in this county had to use when talking to her, and he managed it the way he managed most things, without giving anything away in his expression. Controlled, professional. The face of a man who had learned that his face was a business tool. "Mrs. Voss." He glanced at the letter on the counter. "I expected you earlier in the month. I needed time to think, of course." He picked up the letter, looked at it briefly. He obviously knew what it said, had probably written most of it himself, and gestured toward his office door. "Please." She followed him in. The office was small and well organized, the kind of space that tells you exactly what kind of man occupies it. The papers filed correctly, the desk clear of everything that wasn't immediately necessary, the single painting on the wall, a landscape of the kind that suggests prosperity without making any specific claim about taste. She sat in the chair across from his desk. The chair was too small for her. The arms came in at the wrong angle, too narrow, designed for someone with different proportions than hers. She'd been sitting in chairs that were too small for her whole life. She'd learned not to let furniture make decisions for her. Merritt sat, set the letter between them on the desk, folded his hands. The note, he said. Your father's outstanding balance. You understand the terms. I understand the terms. Full payment within 90 days of notice, which was served. May the 3rd, Clara said. That puts me at September the 1st, a small pause. He hadn't expected her to have the date ready. She watched him absorb this and file it somewhere in his internal accounting of the conversation. September, the 1st, yes, I'll meet it. A longer pause this time. The kind of pause that has something working in it. A man running calculations, checking the columns, deciding how much of what he's actually thinking to let into his expression. Mrs. Voss. He set his hands flat on the desk, in the way that people do when they're about to say something they've prepared. Your father was a valued customer of this bank for many years. We have every sympathy for your situation. The bank understands that this has been a difficult. I know what the balance is, Clara said. He stopped. I know what the ranch accounts look like. I know what the operating costs are. I know what the West Field has cost this ranch over the past 10 years in money and time, and she stopped herself. That last part wasn't useful. I'm not asking you to forgive the note. I'm not asking for an extension beyond the terms. I'm telling you that on September the 1st I will bring you the full amount. Merritt looked at her, not up at her. He'd adjusted enough for that, the slight tilt that became automatic for anyone who spent more than a few minutes in conversation with her. He looked at her, the way a man looks at something he's trying to assess without showing he's assessing it. Measuring, calculating. The West Field, he said carefully. Among other things, Clara, he rarely used first names. It was a sign, she'd learned to read it over the years, of a shift in register, from the professional to the personal, which in a banker's case usually meant the personal was being weaponized in service of the professional. 3 men have tried to work that field. Your father tried. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The drainage situation. I know what the drainage situation is. The ground is. I know what the ground is. She stood up. Not in anger. She'd made a decision years ago that she would not let Aldous Merritt or anyone like him make her angry in their office, because anger in other people's offices only ever served the person sitting behind the desk. She stood up because she was done with this particular chair and this particular conversation. 90 days, Mr. Merritt. I'll be here on September the 1st. She picked up the letter from the desk, her letter, the one with her name written under her father's crossed-out name, and put it back in her coat pocket. She walked out. She didn't look back at him. But if she'd turned around in the doorway of that office, in the moment before she ducked under the doorframe and stepped back out into the main room of the bank, she would have seen Aldous Merritt sit very still for a long moment, looking at the space she'd just left. And then she would have seen him open the top drawer of his desk, take out a cream-colored envelope, already addressed, already sealed, Trans-Western Railroad Land Office, Cheyenne, Wyoming. He held it for a moment, turned it once in his hands, tapped the corner against the desk surface, once, twice. A small, deliberate gesture, the gesture of a man not quite ready to commit to something. Then he set it back in the drawer, closed it, and went to his next appointment. Clara stood on the boardwalk outside the bank for a moment and let the morning heat settle around her. September the 1st, 92 days from today, which meant she'd already used 2 of them, thinking and sleeping badly, and reading her father's 3 lines over and over in the kitchen. At 3 in the morning. 90 days left, exactly what the terms of the note said she had. Nothing more, nothing she'd asked for. The street was already getting its morning business started. Wagons. A few horses tied at various posts. The sound of Orrin Falk's feed and seed opening up across the way. The particular creak of that door. That you could hear half a block in either direction. She needed to go there next. She needed names. Orrin Falk's feed and seed had been on the corner of Main and 2nd Street for 18 years, occupying a building that had been 3 different things before Falk bought it and turned it into what it was now, which was less a store and more a clearinghouse. That was the most accurate word for it. A clearinghouse. Every piece of information that moved through Harlan County passed through Falk's store at some point, either because Falk himself had collected it, or because the men who stood around in the store on slow mornings had offered it, or because the simple fact of being the place where everyone bought their feed and their grain and their basic supplies meant that Falk occupied a position of centrality in the county's social architecture that no amount of deliberate information gathering could have matched. He knew who was struggling. He knew who was behind on their feed bills. He knew which ranches were laying off hands and which were taking them on. He knew which animals had been sold and which were still looking for buyers, and why the buyers weren't buying. This was what Clara needed. She pushed open the door, 4 men inside. Falk himself behind the counter, heavy-set, mid-50s, with the specific kind of confidence that accumulates in a man who has been right about most things in a small community for a long time and has started to mistake the record for a law of nature. 2 ranchers from the eastern properties that Clara knew, by face if not by name, and a young cowhand near the back, maybe 19, buying grain, with the careful economy of someone working a tight feed budget. All 4 of them looked up when the floor made its sounds. The cowhand's head actually turned before the rest of him the way young men's heads do when they hear something unexpected. A quick automatic movement. Then the longer look that followed the quick one. The ranchers by the window were more practiced. They turned and looked and settled into the looking without the initial flinch. Falk set down his ledger. Mrs. Voss. Morning. She walked to the counter. I need information that I can usually manage. He put his palms on the counter in a gesture she'd seen him make 1,000 times. The gesture of a man presenting himself as helpful, which was different from the gesture of a man who was actually about to be helpful. What kind? Horses, Clara said. Who has stock they can't move? Old animals, injured animals. Animals people have stopped seeing value in. I need 20 head. The silence that followed was of a specific kind, not the uncomfortable silence of people avoiding something. Not the hostile silence of people who've decided to stonewall you. This was the genuinely baffled silence of people, confronted with a sentence that didn't parse the way sentences usually parsed, that arrived in the mind and sat there, not quite making the connections it needed to make. Falk stared at her. One of the ranchers by the window actually turned away from what he'd been looking at and stared, not rudely, just reflexively. 20, Falk said. 20. What kind of stock? Draft horses? Work animals? Work animals. Sound legs. That's the only thing that matters. Doesn't matter what else is wrong. Age, temperament, whatever else people might have decided makes them not worth keeping. I want horses other people have given up on. The silence reconstituted itself around this specification. Falk looked at her with the expression of a man who is doing 2 things simultaneously, feeling sorry for someone and trying to figure out how to say so without making it worse. Clara. He almost never used her first name. It was a register shift she'd learned to recognize, from the transactional to the personal, which in Falk's case meant he was about to say something he thought was for her benefit. You know what your situation is with Reed's Bank. You know what the ranch accounts, First Harlan Bank, she said. And yes, I know what the accounts look like. Orrin, I'm not asking for credit. I have enough to buy the animals. What I need are the names. What are you going to put 20 horses on? The rancher by the window asked. He wasn't being rude. She could tell the difference. And this wasn't it. He was genuinely puzzled. The question was an honest one. The West Field? Yes, there it was. The quality of silence in the room shifted again. This time it was a different kind of shift, from confusion to comprehension, which sounds like an improvement but wasn't in this case. Because comprehension here meant, oh, I understand what this is now. This is what happens when grief makes a person unwise. She'd been expecting it. It didn't mean she had to accommodate it. Then Falk laughed, short. Not cruel. Oren Falk was not a cruel man, and she'd never thought he was, even on the days she most wanted to. It was the short, involuntary exhale of a man who has heard something that his body treated as absurd before his manners could intervene. The dead ground, he said. It's not dead, Clara. It's not dead, and I'm not asking for your opinion about it. She kept her voice level. Precisely level, not flat, not hard. But the specific register of someone who has decided not to be moved by this particular conversation and means it. I'm asking for names. Who in this county has horses they can't move? He looked at her for a long moment. The look said, I feel sorry for you, and I don't know how to say it in a way that doesn't make it worse. And I've decided that giving you what you're asking for is the kindest thing I can do, even though I think it's going to end badly. He reached under the counter and pulled out a different ledger from the one he'd been working in when she arrived. Master, the one he kept for accounts owed across the county. The debts and the difficulties, and the who has what and why. Hester Malloy out on Creek Road, he said slowly. She's been trying to sell 6 horses since March. Her husband died in the winter. She can't feed them through summer. They're old, 14, 15 years, some of them, but they're sound. He turned a page. Thomas Lutz Greer's been trying to sell 4 animals since spring. He'll tell you they're young and difficult. 2 of them are biters. They've run off 2 of his hands. He paused. He's asking too much for them, but he'll come down if you make a real offer. Another page. Man came through 3 weeks ago, left 5 horses at the livery because he couldn't pay the board and didn't want to take them where he was going. Joe Aldenhoff's been trying to find a buyer. Nobody wants them because 2 of them have old leg injuries. He looked up. That's 50, enough to start, Clara said. Write letters for me, to Mrs. Malloy, to Greer, and to Aldenhoff. Tell them I'll come in the next 3 days and I'll pay a fair price. Falk shook his head slowly, but he reached for paper and pen. Because whatever Oren Falk thought about this particular situation, and she could see clearly what he thought, it was written on his face in the way that feelings are always written on the faces of people who consider themselves honest. He had been raised to respond to a direct request with a direct action, and Clara Voss had always paid what she owed. He wrote the letters, 3 of them, quick, efficient, the penmanship of a man who'd written 1,000 letters of this kind. She took them, folded them into her coat pocket alongside the bank letter. Behind her, as she moved toward the door, the young cowhand by the back wall said something. Very quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, the way people say things they can't quite keep inside. 20 horses on the dead ground. What is she going to do with 20 horses on the dead ground? Clara heard him. She kept walking. He lived at the end of a dirt track east of town that was less a road and more a suggestion. A place where the grass grew shorter because wheels had passed over it often enough to discourage it, and where the ruts were shallow and inconsistent, the way ruts are when the traffic is infrequent but regular. His property was small. 1/2 acre, maybe. Schoolhouse, a house that more accurately described as a collection of well-maintained tools with walls around them. The kind of dwelling that accumulates around a man who cares more about the integrity of his equipment than the comfort of his living space. A lean-to for his horse. A garden that produced beans and not much else, because the soil out that direction had its own opinions about what it wanted to grow. Clara had known Silas Breck since she was 12 years old. He'd worked for her father twice, once in 1863 on the Eastfield drainage system, once in 1871 on the barn foundation, when the original foundation had started settling wrong and her father needed someone who understood how ground behaved under weight. Both times he'd done the work correctly and efficiently and charged exactly what he'd said. Said he would charge and left when the work was finished. And that was the entirety of their professional relationship, which her father had described in his journal as the best working arrangement I have ever had with any man in this county. She rode out on the afternoon of June 2nd. He was in his yard when she arrived, sharpening a long-handled spade with a flat file, the slow, deliberate strokes of a man who was not rushing this because he understood that rushing this would mean doing it again sooner. He heard her horse. He set down the file. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected someone to come eventually, and was not entirely surprised it was her. Miss Clara. He still called her that, the way he had when she was 12, and he was a man of 51, come to fix her father's field. And she'd followed him around for 3 days, asking questions about drainage until he'd finally sat down with her on a fence rail and explained it all in terms she could understand. Clearly and without condescension, as if a 12-year-old's interest in how water moved through earth was a perfectly normal thing and deserving of a real answer, Mr. Breck. She dismounted and tied Ruth to his post, reached into her coat pocket, past the bank letter, past the 3 letters Falk had written for her, and took out the journal. I need you to look at something. He took it from her. He was a man who read carefully, not slowly, but deliberately, with the quality of attention. That means he was not going to need to read it again. He read it once, tilted the journal toward the afternoon light, and read it again. Adjusting for the direction of the sun, closed it carefully and held both hands for a moment without saying anything. Your father wrote this, he said finally. Not a question. The year before he died. I think he was working on the problem again. I think he knew where the blockage was. Silas Breck looked at her steadily. He had the face of a man who had spent 50 years outdoors, and it showed in the way faces show outdoor lives. The lines, the particular weathering around the eyes, the skin that has been negotiating with sun and wind for so long that it has reached an accommodation. He knew where it was in 1869, Silas said. Clara went very still. He found it that year. Silas turned and looked out at the line of trees behind his property. Not at anything in particular, but the way a man looks at a middle distance when he's accessing a memory he'd rather not access. We walked that field together. He'd had the same idea I'd had about the tile system, that the problem wasn't the field itself, it was the drainage line, that something had gone wrong with the main junction. He knew exactly what the problem was. He knew how to fix it. Clara waited. Then why didn't he? Because he couldn't get to it. Silas turned back to her. The ground out there, you've walked it. You know what it's like in the soft sections, over the area, where the main drain runs. You can't get a wagon within 30 yards of the blockage without sinking the wheels. Can't get a loaded cart in. Can't even lead an ox into that section without losing the animal in the mud. He tried a pause. The pause of a man deciding how complete to be. 3 times. 1869, 1871, and 1873. The 3rd time he lost a good horse in the mud. A horse he'd had for 10 years. After that, he stopped trying. Clara looked at the old man. He stopped trying, she said, because he couldn't find something light enough to move on the ground. Silas looked back at her. And in his expression, in the specific quality of stillness that came over it, she saw the shape of something she'd been looking for since she read those 3 lines in her father's journal. She saw the answer. Not her answer, his answer. The answer Silas Breck had been carrying around for 6 years since 1873, without saying it to anyone. You thought of it, she said. You thought of horses. He was quiet for a moment that had more weight in it than a moment of that length usually carried. The quiet of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask him a question he'd been rehearsing the answer to for a long time. After the 3rd time, he said, E3. I was walking back from the field. Your father had already gone inside. He was done. I could see it in the way he walked, and I was thinking about the problem. And I thought, the right animal, 4 legs, light feet, better sense of ground than any wheel ever had. An animal that would feel where the surface was firm before it committed its weight. He paused. I thought it might work. Why didn't you tell him? The next silence was longer. Silas Breck turned away from her again and looked at the trees, and she let him look because she could see. This was not a question that had a quick answer. Because he was exhausted, he said finally. Because I had watched that man look at that field for the better part of 20 years, and what I saw in his face wasn't just the practical problem of the drainage. It was the weight of carrying a thing you can't finish. The specific weight of that. He stopped, restarted. I thought, if I tell him this, and it doesn't work, I've taken the last piece of hope he had and turned it into one more failure. And he was 60 years old, and his heart was already tired. I could see that his heart was tired. He paused, so I didn't tell him. He turned back to her, and then he died. And I've been sitting with that for 8 months. The yard around them was quiet. Behind the house, somewhere in the trees, a meadowlark was going through its whole song with the patience of a creature that has no concept of bank deadlines or dead ground, or things left unfinished by men who ran out of time. The meadowlark's song filled the quiet, and then the quiet refilled itself when the song was done. "Will you help me?" Clara said. Silas Breck picked up his file, turned the spade over in his hands, ran the file once slowly along the edge, the way he'd been doing when she arrived. Then he set it down. "I'm not as fast as I used to be," he said. "I know. My back goes sideways in wet conditions. Has for the past 3 years, I know. Day wage. Same as I charged your father in '63. Done." He nodded once. Went to the lean-to, where his tools hung on the wall in the specific order that a man's tools accumulate when he uses them regularly enough to know where each one needs to be. He pulled down the long iron probe, 4 feet of solid metal with a pointed end for reading ground, and the smaller angled shovel and a leather roll of smaller instruments she didn't recognize. "We'll walk the west field tomorrow," he said, "first light, before the heat gets unreasonable." "Thank you, Mr. Breck. Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't found anything yet," he said it practically. Not pessimistically, not as a discouragement. As a statement of the current fact, which was that they had a hypothesis and not yet a finding. Finding was a different thing from hypothesizing, and Silas Breck was a man who kept the distinction clear. Clara untied Ruth from the post. She had the name of an old ditchman who understood what the problem was and was willing to help fix it. She still needed the horses. That evening, she went to see Hester Malloy. Mrs. Malloy lived on Creek Road in a house that was slightly too large for one person. The particular, slight too largeness of houses that were built for families and haven't yet adjusted to the new smaller life that circumstances have imposed. She was in her early 60s, a compact, precise woman, with the hands of someone who had been doing physical work outdoors for 40 years, and she met Clara at the gate of the south paddock, where the horses were standing in the late afternoon light. "Mrs. Voss." She said it without the particular edge of surprise that Clara's height still produced in people who'd known her for years, but didn't see her often. Orrin Falk said, "You might be coming." The 6 horses in the paddock were old. That was the first thing visible about them. Bay geldings, mostly, with the particular deliberateness of aged animals that have long since stopped spending energy on skittishness and have settled into a more considered relationship with the world. They moved toward the fence when Clara and Mrs. Malloy approached, not with the excitement of young horses, but with the measured interest of animals, who have been around long enough to know that people appearing at fences sometimes meant food. One of them was different. The oldest, a dark mare, almost black, who stood slightly apart from the geldings and watched Clara's approach with an expression of absolute stillness, not wary, not excited, just watching. With the particular, focused attention of an animal that has been paying attention for a long time and has learned to get a lot of information from it. "That one," Clara said. "What's her name?" "Petra." Mrs. Malloy crossed her arms. "She's the oldest, 16 in the spring. She's the one that leads the others. Where she goes, they go. Has been since she was 4 years old." She paused. "I've been trying to sell all 6 since March. Nobody wants old horses. People want young stock." Clara looked at Petra. The mare looked back, not the sizing up look of an animal. "All assessing a potential threat. not the blank look of an animal not particularly paying attention. Something between those two things, the direct, unhurried attention of a creature that had been around long enough to know the difference, someone worth watching and someone not worth watching, and had decided Clara was worth watching. "I'll take all 6. "Clara," said Mrs. Malloy, looked at her, then at the paddock, then back at Clara. "You're August Voss's daughter," she said. "I knew your father." "Yes. He bought a horse from me once, years ago. He never told me the horse was sick. I didn't know it until after. He just paid what I was asking and took it home." She uncrossed her arms. "I always thought about that. That he never tried to negotiate me down, even though he could have. Even though the horse died 3 months later. He couldn't watch something struggle and not try to help it," Clara said. "It was the main problem he had his whole life." Mrs. Malloy looked at her for a moment. The same specific look Clara had gotten all her life. The one that meant someone was seeing something in her they hadn't expected and weren't quite sure what to make of. "Fair price," the older woman said. "Fair price," Clara confirmed. She paid. Took the receipt. Made arrangements to collect the horses in 2 days. As she rode back toward the ranch in the dimming light, Petra's steady gaze stayed with her somehow. The image of it, the quality of it. The way the mare had looked at her without expectation or hope, just paying attention. The way old animals learn to pay attention to things that might matter. Because old animals have learned, through the accumulation of long experience, that the next thing is worth seeing clearly even when you don't know yet what it is. She still had 14 horses to buy, and 89 days left, and a drainage problem that 3 generations of efforts had failed to solve. But she had Silas Breck, and she had Petra, and somewhere in her father's journal, in 3 lines of shaking handwriting, she had what she was now certain were instructions, not a record of failure. Instructions. She rode home in the dark and went to sleep for the first time in 6 weeks, without lying awake doing arithmetic. She got the 4 horses from Thomas Greer the following morning. His property was on the North Road, a working ranch of middling size that had the specific appearance of a place being maintained rather than improved. Everything functional, nothing new. The particular aesthetic of a man spending money to stay in place, rather than to move forward. Greer himself was waiting at the gate when she rode up, which meant Falk's letter had arrived, and he'd been expecting her, and had opinions about the meeting that he'd been rehearsing. He was a lean man in his late 40s, with a face that had settled into the expression of someone perpetually calculating whether something was worth the trouble. He looked at Clara the way he always looked at her, the adjustment, the recalibration, the settling into the looking, and then got down to business. "The 4 animals I've got are young," he said. 2 mares and 2 geldings. The mares are fine. The geldings are the problem. What's the problem? They bite. He said it with the directness of a man who has learned that softening this particular fact does not help anyone. Not mean. I want to be clear about that. Not vicious animals. But they bite. They've run off 2 of my hands in the past year, and I can't afford to keep losing hands over horses. Have your hands been patient with them?" Greer thought about this with the seriousness the question deserved. "No," he said finally. "My hands have not been patient animals." "Then that may be most of the problem." He looked at her. "You want to buy biters. I want to buy 4 horses that other people have stopped seeing value in. That's what I told Orrin Falk, and that's what I'm telling you. What are you asking?" He named a number. It was too high. They both knew it was too high. She offered less. He came down. She came up slightly. They arrived at a number that was fair, not generous on either side, but fair, which was what she'd told Mrs. Malloy and what she would tell everyone else. Fair price. She had enough money to buy 20 horses at fair prices, and nothing left over for anything else. Which meant this had to be done right. No wasted money. No buying something that would turn out to be wrong. The 4 animals were in a pen behind the main barn. The mares were, as Greer had said, fine, young, sound, well-fed. Simply difficult in the way of horses that had not been handled with sufficient consistency in their early training. The kind of difficulty that patience could address. The geldings were watching her from the far end of the pen, with the specific alertness of animals that had learned that humans approaching meant something unpredictable was about to happen. One of them had his ears back. The other was very still, in the way that sometimes precedes sudden movement. She went in slowly. No sudden gestures. She talked to them in the low, even tone she'd been using with horses since she was old enough to talk. The tone that carried no information except "I'm here, and I'm not in a hurry, and there's nothing to worry about." The gelding with the ears back kept watching her. The still one gradually shifted his weight, which was a good sign. It meant the calculation was ongoing, rather than already decided. She spent 20 minutes in the pen before she put a hand on either of them. When she came out, Greer was leaning on the fence with the expression of a man who has watched something he wasn't entirely expecting. "They let you touch them," he said. "Yes, they don't let my hands touch them." "Your hands are probably in too much of a hurry." He thought about this. "Possibly," he said. He helped her load them. He was a competent horseman, whatever his hired men's shortcomings were, and the loading went smoothly once the animals understood that she was the one making the decisions. She drove the four of them to join the Malloy mares at her south pasture, and then went on to the livery. Joe Aldenhoff ran the Harlan livery, with the specific conscientiousness of a man who felt personally responsible for anything left in his care. This was professionally useful and occasionally inconvenient, as it meant he'd spent the past 3 weeks feeding and watering 5 horses that weren't his, and for which he was not being compensated, which had made him both more eager to find them a buyer and more anxious about who that buyer might be. He met Clara at the livery door, with the expression of a man who was relieved and worried simultaneously. "The 5 horses," she said. "The ones left by the traveler?" "Yes." He led her inside. "I want to be up front with you. 2 of them have leg problems. Old injuries, they're healed, they're not in pain, they move fine. But they move differently than sound horses, more carefully. Each step is a decision rather than a habit." She looked at the 5 animals in the stalls he'd put them in. 3 were unremarkable, well-built, healthy, the kind of horses that become invisible because there's nothing specifically wrong with them, which was probably why the man who'd left them hadn't been able to sell them, in whatever county he'd come from. They just looked like horses. The other 2 were different. One had a knee that had healed at a slight angle, visible if you knew what to look for, invisible if you didn't. The other had a hock that had thickened from an old sprain, the kind of thickening that stays after the injury has healed, a permanent reminder written in the tissue. She watched them both move in the confined space of the stall. Aldenhoff was right. They moved carefully, not painfully. There was no flinching, no shortening of stride, to avoid weight-bearing on the damaged limb. But deliberately. Every footfall placed rather than assumed, as if they had learned, from the experience of the injury itself, that the ground was something that deserved attention. "I'll take all 5, Clara said. Aldenhoff exhaled, the specific exhale of a man who has been holding a breath he'd been holding for weeks. "You know, people are saying you've lost your mind," he said. He said it factually, not unkindly, in the tone of a man delivering information he thought she should have. "The West Field isn't what people think it is. 3 men have tried to work that field. 2 of them tried twice. Your father." "I know what my father tried." She looked at him directly. Not sharply. She'd made a decision some years ago that sharpness was usually a waste of precision, deployed when patience and clarity would serve better. "My father knew what was wrong with the field. He couldn't fix it from outside. I'm going to fix it from inside. That's the difference." Aldenhoff looked at her with the expression of a careful man confronted with a statement he couldn't quite argue with but wasn't ready to agree with. "Your father used to say the land would outlast every opinion people had of it," he said finally. "Was right about most things," Clara said. "He just ran out of time." She paid. Fair price, took the receipt. That was 15 horses in her south pasture by Thursday evening, and she stood at the fence as the light went flat and golden and counted them, and felt the single missing one, the way you feel a gap in a row of teeth. not painful, but impossible to stop tonguing at. She'd exhausted the obvious sources. Falk's letters had gotten her this far, and she'd followed every lead in them. She could send word to the next county, but that was time and money she didn't have. And the horse she needed. The 20th horse, the one that completed the number she'd fixed on from the moment she read her father's journal. Felt close. Felt like something that would resolve itself if she waited for it. So she waited. The following morning, she rode into Harlan for supplies. The horse was tied to the post outside Falk's store. She saw it from across the street and stopped Ruth without deciding to stop her. The halt was automatic. The response of someone who has seen something that requires their full attention before they do anything else. Gray. Iron gray with no particular warmth to the color. Thin. Not dangerously thin, but the leanness of an animal that has been on short rations for long enough that the body has started to economize. Standing very still. The stillness of an animal that has learned, somewhere in its history, that stillness is the safest option. Its left hind leg was slightly off, not broken, not actively injured, but healed wrong. The specific wrongness of an old fracture that had calcified at an imperfect angle because it hadn't gotten proper care in the critical weeks right after the break. The kind of thing that happens to young horses in bad ground. A wrong step, an unexpected soft spot, a moment of trusting a surface that couldn't be trusted. If it doesn't get treatment fast, the bone heals at whatever angle it settled into, and the animal carries that angle for the rest of its life. Doesn't necessarily cause pain, just changes how it moves. Slower, more careful. The kind of careful that looks, to people who aren't paying attention, like reluctance or stubbornness or general uselessness. The kind of careful that makes people decide the animal isn't worth feeding. Clara crossed the street. The gray lifted its head when she approached. Not startled, she'd moved slowly, in the unhurried way she always moved around horses she didn't know, but alert. Taking her in. A direct assessment, steady and patient. The way an animal looks at something it's decided to understand before it decides anything else. She put her hand out, palm flat. The gray dropped its nose and sniffed her once. Then stood quietly. "What happened to you?" Clara said. Not quite a question, the gray blinked. She waited for the owner. He came out of Falk's store 10 minutes later, a man in his 40s, travel-worn, with the look of someone who had been carrying a problem for weeks and hadn't found anyone willing to take it off him. He looked at Clara. Up and up and up, adjusting the way everyone adjusted. "The horse," Clara said. He glanced at the gray. "She's got a bad leg. She can't do real work. She's not good for." "What are you asking?" He named a price that was almost nothing. The price of a man who has stopped believing the thing he's selling has value and just wants to be done with it. Clara paid it without negotiating. She took the lead rope, turned toward the livery to get her trailer. Behind her, she heard the sound of Falk's store door opening, heard Falk himself step out onto the boardwalk, and next to him, she could tell by the lighter footstep, Tobias, his son, 19 years old, doing a summer's work in the store before deciding what to do next with his life. "Lord Almighty," Falk said, not loud. The quiet exhale of a man confronted with something that exceeded his predictions. "She's done it. 20 horses." And then, Tobias, quieter, almost to himself, the way you say something when you're not quite sure you're supposed to say it out loud. "Those horses won't fix anything." Clara heard both of them. She kept walking. The gray walked beside her, the lead rope hanging loose between them. 4 feet, finding the town's hard-packed surface with the particular deliberateness of an animal that had learned never to assume anything about what it was walking on. She named the gray Copper, not because of the color. The horse was gray, flat iron gray, nothing copper about it. But because of what happened the second morning, when she put all 20 horses in the south pasture together for the first time, and stood at the fence with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before she thought to drink it, watching them sort themselves out. Horses sort themselves. It's one of the things they do when you put a new group together. The invisible negotiations, the small adjustments of position and posture and eye contact that established the working social order. Petra moved to the front naturally, with the ease of an animal that has been leading other animals for 16 years and doesn't feel the need to make a point of it. The Malloy mares settled in around her. The young Greer animals tested the edges, the biters nipping at anyone who got too close until the older horses made clear that this was not going to be useful behavior, and the young ones settled. Copper went to the corner. Not pushed there, not retreating there. Choosing it, the corner where the fence met the water trough, where you could see the whole pasture in one sight line, with your back against two solid walls. The position of a horse that wants information before it wants interaction. She stood there and watched the other animals with calm, measuring eyes, and didn't involve herself in any of the negotiations, just watched. Clara watched her watch them, and thought, this one knows things. She didn't know yet what kind of things. She would. She had 83 days left and a journal with 3 lines in it and an old ditchman with a bad back and 20 horses that nobody had wanted. She went inside and went to bed. He arrived at the ranch the same evening. She brought Copper home. Fast, the way 19-year-olds arrive with important information, slightly out of breath and not quite sure how to begin. Clara was in the barn when she heard his horse. She came out to find him dismounting before the horse had fully stopped, which told her the information was urgent enough that he hadn't let himself slow down to think about whether to come or what to say. When he got there, Mrs. Voss, Tobias. She looked at him. Read him the way you read a young person who's been carrying something heavy for a while. The tension in the jaw, the specific quality of the out-of-breath that wasn't from the ride. What happened last night? At the saloon, he was working to catch his breath, not from the ride. From whatever he'd been carrying since the night before. My father was there. I was bringing him something he'd left, his hat. I came in through the back door and they didn't see me. Who? Mr. Merritt. And a man I didn't recognize, well-dressed. Not from here. The quality of the evening around them shifted. Not the physical evening. The air was still warm and still, and the south pasture was still quiet, with 20 horses settling into their first night together. But something in the quality of her attention changed, tightened. The way attention tightens when it understands that what it's about to receive is going to matter. Tell me, she said, Tobias told her. The man with Merritt was named something that might have been Glendon. Tobias wasn't certain, had only caught it once in a conversation he'd been listening to from 10 feet away in the dark of a doorway. He represented Trans-Western Railroad. He had maps spread on the table between himself and Merritt, and he'd pointed to a line on those maps, a rail spur line, planned to run through Harlan County, connecting the county to the main Cheyenne Junction. Faster freight, faster passage. The kind of thing that would change the economic landscape of a county like this one. In ways that were hard to predict but easy to understand the general direction of. The spur line ran directly through the eastern section of Voss Ranch, the section with the best road access, the flattest terrain, the natural grade that made it useful for track laying. The section, in other words, that the railroad needed and that Clara happened to own. Trans-Western had offered Merritt something for his help. Not a bribe. The conversation Tobias described was too careful for anything as crude as a bribe. A finder's arrangement. The kind of thing that was standard practice when a bank held a note on a property that a railroad company wanted, and the bank could facilitate the acquisition in a way that was beneficial to all parties, meaning all parties, except the one whose property was being acquired. Merritt hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He'd said he needed to see how things developed over the next few months, 90 days to see how things developed. Clara stood in her yard and held all of this. She didn't feel the sharp, hot thing she might have expected, the collapse of solid ground under her feet, the betrayal that would have made sense given what she'd just learned about, the man she'd spent the morning talking to about terms and deadlines, and the word of First Harlan Bank. She felt something colder, more precise. The specific feeling of the moment when you understand exactly what you're working with, when the shape of the problem becomes clear. and the shape is harder than you thought but also more knowable, more defined. You feel the edge of the tool and you understand what it's for. Merritt was not her enemy. He was a man with competing interests in a situation that had more than one possible resolution. He was waiting to see which resolution would materialize before he committed to helping it along. That was not the same as being her enemy. It was the behavior of a careful man who hadn't made up his mind. She had 83 days to make up his mind for him. "Does your father know you're here?" she said. Tobias shook his head. "He'd tell me not to come, but you came anyway." He met her eyes. There was something there, the look of a young man who has just recently and explicitly decided what kind of person he wants to be, and is still close enough to the decision that it shows. Not confidence exactly, more like intention. The intention of a person who has not yet had enough time to find out whether they can hold to it. "It didn't seem right," he said, "what they were talking about. I kept thinking about it all night, and—" "Thank you," Clara said. "I mean that," he nodded. Looked at the south pasture, where 20 horses were visible in the fading light, moving with the slow, unhurried motion of animals who had been fed and watered and had arrived somewhere for the night. "What are you going to do?" he said. She looked at the south pasture too. 20 horses. 20 animals nobody had wanted. "I'm going to fix the drainage on the west field," she said. "I'm going to plant the best bottom land crop this county has seen in 30 years. And I'm going to walk into Merritt's bank on September the 1st and pay every cent of that note." Tobias was quiet. "Don't tell your father yet," she said. "Not about Merritt. Not about the railroad. Why not?" "Because your father is a man who likes to know how a story ends before he decides which side he's on. If he knows about the railroad, he'll spend the next 3 months deciding which outcome is safer to align himself with." She looked at the boy. "But if he sees what I'm doing first, if he watches it happen week by week, without the context of the railroad, he might just decide to help because it's the right thing to do." Tobias thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "He laughed at you," he said, "this morning. At the store. When you left with the horse, I know, that bothered him. He didn't say anything about it, but I could tell. He went quiet after." "Good," Clara said. "That means there's something to work with." She sent him home. Then she stood in the yard for a while longer in the full dark, looking out in the direction of the west field even though she couldn't see it from here. The 100 dark acres of waiting ground. The problem her father had carried for 20 years. The drain line somewhere, under all that wrong water, blocked at a junction her father had found and mapped and written about in 3 lines of shaking handwriting, leaving the rest for whoever came after him. 83 days. An old man with a bad back and an iron probe. 20 horses nobody had wanted. And somewhere under 100 acres of dead ground. A drain line that her father had first laid with his own young hands before she was born, 30 years ago. Believing it would matter. She went inside and read the 3 lines one more time. Then she closed the journal and went to sleep. Silas arrived at the gate at 5:15 the following morning. This was exactly when he'd said he would arrive, which meant he'd probably been awake since 3, and had spent the intervening hours doing what craftsmen do before a job that matters. Checking equipment, running through the sequence of what comes first and what comes after. Accounting for what he knew and what he didn't know, and how the unknown parts would be navigated when they revealed themselves. He had the long iron probe over one shoulder and the leather roll of smaller tools across his back, and the expression of a man who had been saving up his energy for this particular task for 8 months without knowing it, and was now experiencing the specific clarity of a person, finally able to apply preparation to an actual problem. Miss Clara. Mr. Breck, she had Petra on a long lead already. The dark mare had been calm through the harnessing. Calm in the way she was calm through everything. The calm of an animal that has decided the world is generally manageable, and reserves its concern for things that actually warrant it. She stood at Clara's shoulder and looked at Silas, and the look she gave him was the same one she gave everything. Direct, measuring, patient. They went into the field together. The sun was coming up flat and white over the eastern ridge, the way it did in drought years. No softness to it, no gradual warming. Just the hard, direct light of a sky that wasn't interested in ceremony. The coarse yellow grass of the west field caught it and gave nothing back, flat and dull, and wrong-colored in the way that grass is wrong-colored when the water beneath it is wrong. Petra moved carefully. Not nervously. There was no nervousness in Petra. Clara had already understood this from 2 days of watching her. The mare had moved past nervousness sometime in her middle years and arrived at something more useful, a careful, deliberate engagement with the world that looked from the outside like calm, but was actually a form of concentrated attention. She tested each step before she committed to it. She moved at an angle, not straight into the field but northeast, following some reading of the ground that her feet were giving her. That wasn't visible from above. Silas watched her. "Let her go," he said quietly. Clara loosened the lead to its full length, not guiding, just attached. Just present, Petra moved northeast. She stopped the way a deliberate animal stops, all 4 feet planted at once, head lowering, and then one front hoof beginning to paw at the ground, not the pawing of a nervous horse, not the scratching of a bored one. Methodical, slow, as if she were trying to communicate them to the people behind her, and understood that communication required repetition. Fex. Silas moved up beside her and pushed the probe into the earth where she was pawing. He pushed it slowly, reading the resistance through his palms, the way a man reads text with his fingers. The information was there in the texture of what he felt, in the way resistance changed with depth, in the small variations that meant one thing rather than another, at 11 inches, solid, but with a hollow quality underneath the solidity. Not the hollow of empty space, more like the hollow of something dense and structured, something that had been built rather than naturally deposited. He moved the probe 6 inches to the left, same, 6 inches to the right, soft. The probe sank past 14 inches before it found resistance worth noting, 8 feet north. Same depth, same hollow solidity. He straightened up, put his free hand on the small of his back for a moment, the gesture of a man whose back had opinions, and looked at Clara. "There's something here," he said, a line running northeast to southwest. Firm at 11 inches, with a hollow quality that isn't natural hardpan. He pressed his lips together, running the information through whatever internal catalog he kept, of things he'd felt through probes over 50 years of this work. Could be the roadbed. Clara felt something move through her chest. She kept it contained. She was good at this, had gotten good at it through practice. But it was there. "Roadbed," she said. "Old farm roads in this part of Wyoming were crowned," Silas said, half to himself, the way experts narrate when they're thinking as much as explaining. Built up in the center so water ran off to the sides. If this land had a road through it before the creek shifted its course, and some of these low fields did 20-30 years ago, the road might still be there, buried under silt and grass. But there, he looked at her. If it's there, you'd have a work surface, something firm enough to move on with horses, something to work from. "Then we find it," Clara said. "Tomorrow, full light. Bring Petra again." He looked at the sky, the white hard sky of a drought year, and pray the rain holds off. "The rain hasn't fallen 6 weeks, I know. I'm praying it keeps not falling." He looked at Petra, who had resumed standing with that absolute focused calm, ears forward, watching them both with the expression of an animal that had done what it was asked and was waiting to find out whether the people it worked with were going to understand. "Your father had a good idea," Silas said. "He just needed the right help with it." Clara put her hand flat on Petra's neck. The mare stood steady under it. "Yes," she said. "He did." In the 16 days that followed, they walked the west field inch by inch, Silas with his probe, reading the ground through his palms, Petra showing them the path. The mare had found it on the 2nd day, the crowned surface of the buried road, and had begun to repeat the route with the precision of an animal that remembers through its body rather than its mind. Clara with stakes and twine, mapping what they found. The line of it, the angle. The places where the crown held firm, and the places where it had settled, and the narrower sections that required more care, was slow work. The heat came early and came back worse in the afternoons, and they kept to the mornings and did other things in the afternoons that had to be managed. The equipment that needed attention, the small repairs that ranch work always generated, regardless of what larger projects were underway. By June 27th, they had a map, not a complete map. Working map, the kind you make when you know enough to proceed, and not enough to be certain. A line running northeast to southwest for 230 yards, 6 feet of reliable surface at the crown, maybe 8 in the wider sections. Enough for a horse to carry a load without sinking, enough to work from, and at the southwest end of that line, where it curved toward the western edge of the field, Stone Bend, exactly where the journal said it would be. The drain junction, the drain line itself, was there. Old clay tile, laid in the 1850s by whoever had first tried to work this bottom land, still holding its grade after 30 years of sitting in wrong water. Still intact, still connected, from the West Creek Junction all the way to Stone Bend. Still almost functional except at the junction, at the point where the North Branch met the main line at Stone Bend. A section of tile, roughly 4 feet long, had collapsed inward. Ground pressure over 30 wet seasons, the slow, inexorable weight of waterlogged earth pressing on clay that had been laid carefully but hadn't been designed for 3 decades of continuous saturation. The tile had folded, and behind that folded section, 30 years of silt and debris had packed itself into a wall of material so dense and so compressed that it might as well have been concrete. Silas crouched at the edge of what they'd excavated to confirm the location, careful test digs, just enough to see, and looked at the collapsed tile for a long time without saying anything. "Can we fix it?" Clara said. "We can fix it," he said it, with the certainty of a man who has fixed things like this before and understands what fixing them requires. "But we need to get to it first." He looked at the terrain around the junction. The ground here was the worst in the field, the softest, the most saturated, even in this drought, because the water had been sitting here, longest, concentrated by the blockage above. "The access point," he said. "The opening we'd need to dig to reach the collapsed section. It'll have to be narrow. The surrounding ground pressure will close in on anything wider. We shore the walls as we go, but the opening itself." He paused. He looked at Clara. He looked at his own shoulders. He looked back at Clara. Something changed in his expression. She had learned, in 16 days of working alongside Silas Breck, to read his expressions with some accuracy. This one was the expression of a man who had just understood something and was not entirely sure whether he was supposed to say it. "How wide are your shoulders?" he said. Clara had heard many things about her body in 36 years. She had been measured and stared at, and commented upon, in ways kind and unkind and curious and sometimes cruel. She had heard her physical dimensions discussed with specific detachment that people use when they're talking about something they've categorized as remarkable rather than human. But she had never heard that question asked in quite that way. He wasn't asking about her body. He was asking about a problem. She understood the difference. It was one of the most important differences she'd learned to recognize, narrower than you'd think, she said. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." The arithmetic of it settled over them both in the hot morning of the West Field. She was the tallest person in Harlan County, taller than all the men she knew, by a head and sometimes more. But height and shoulder width were not the same proportion in every body, and in Clara Voss's body, in the way that a frame built for height distributes its mass. Her shoulders were narrower in ratio than those of any of the men who might otherwise have been candidates for this task. She was the only person who would fit, not because she was brave, not because she was reckless or desperate, because her body was built differently, and this particular problem required a different kind of body. For 36 years, she had adapted herself to fit a world that was not built for her, ducked through doors, sat in chairs that didn't fit, moved carefully through spaces that assumed everyone was smaller. The world, it turned out, had one door that was built exactly for her. It was just underground. "I'll walk you through every step," Silas said. "I've done this kind of work a dozen times. I'll tell you exactly what to do." "I know you will. It'll be dark in there. Wet, the smell is. 30 years of standing water," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ground. "Your father would have." He stopped. "He would have said something here about the right person for the right job." "Let's figure out what equipment we need," Clara said. He nodded, picked up his tools. They walked back down the crowned road, toward the eastern fence, Petra following behind without being led. She'd started doing this somewhere in the second week, simply falling in behind them when the day's work was done, as if she decided that this was her group now, and she intended to stay with it. Behind them, the West Field lay quiet in the morning light. 100 acres of yellow grass. 30 years of blocked water. One collapsed junction at the end of a drain line that a young man had laid 70 years ago in the belief that it would matter. Clara had 63 days, not many, not impossible. She kept walking. That was when Clara learned to walk differently. Not differently like a person acquiring a new skill. Differently like a person unlearning something. They'd spent 36 years practicing, without ever choosing to practice it. She'd always walked the way tall people learn to walk. With the specific decisiveness that height requires, each step placed like a statement of intent. Because when you're 7 feet tall, hesitation in your movement reads as something else to the people watching you. It reads as confusion. It reads as uncertainty. It reads as a woman who doesn't know where she's going. And Clara had spent her whole life making sure nobody could read that into her. The West Field didn't care about her intentions. The West Field cared about weight. Specifically, the West Field cared about how weight was distributed across a surface that was firm at 11 inches and soft below that, and how long any given section of that surface had to bear a specific amount of weight before it gave way. Long strides meant more time with full weight on one foot. More time on one foot meant more concentrated pressure on a smaller area. More concentrated pressure on a smaller area meant sinking in the sections where the roadbed was narrow or the crown was lower. Silas noticed this on the third morning. He didn't say anything right away. He watched her for an hour. This had become his method, she'd realized. The watching before speaking approach of a man who preferred to understand a problem fully before he offered an opinion on it. He watched the way she moved through the northeast section, following behind Petra with the long lead loose in her hand. Then he said, very simply, "Shorter steps." She stopped. "What? You're covering too much ground per stride. Think less about where you're going. Think more about where you are." She tried it. It felt wrong. Slow. Tentative in a way she actively disliked. The physical equivalent of uncertainty, which was the thing she'd been working hardest all morning not to project, which was, she realized, exactly the point. "Better," Silas said, and it was. Petra kept leading them northeast each morning. She had a route now. Not a route Clara had taught her, but one she'd through the accumulating information of her own feet and the way they read the ground. She repeated it with the precision of an animal, whose memory lives in muscle and tendon rather than in images or language. She moved through the northeast section, curved slightly around the area where the roadbed narrowed, found the path where the crown was widest and firmest, and brought them to the probe points they'd already marked. And then, on the days when they were extending the map further west, she moved ahead of the established markers and found the next section of the road by feel. Clara stopped directing her, Isaac. She just followed. The map on the kitchen table grew. The staked line across the field grew with it. The shape of what was underground became visible, not as something she could see, but as something she could infer from what the probe told Silas and what the stakes told her, and what Petra's footfalls told all of them. The system was larger than the journal had suggested. Not just the main drain line from West Creek Junction to Stone Bend. A network. A branching system of clay tile, laid by whoever had first worked this land in the 1850s. Careful work, skilled work. The kind of work that had probably transformed the field when it was new. Pull the water out of the natural depression. Direct it to the creek bend. Let it drain away instead of sitting in the subsoil. Elegant. When you saw the whole shape of it. 30 years of neglect had worked on it. The way time works on everything built by human hands. Joints had loosened. Grades had shifted by fractions of an inch that compounded into larger wrongnesses. Sections had settled, and at Stone Bend. The catastrophic failure that had taken the whole system down, Silas called it the blocked heart once, almost to himself, while they were mapping the lateral branches. Clara wrote it in the margin of her chart because it was accurate, and she liked accuracy, the blocked heart of a system that had been working for 20 years before it failed, and that had been sitting waiting to be unblocked for 30 years since. Her father had found it, had known what it needed, had written 3 lines in a shaking hand and left them for whoever came next. She was whoever came next. Copper started doing the thing on day 13. That was how she came to think of it, the thing. Because at first she didn't understand it, and then she understood it. And once she understood it, she couldn't unsee it. And the not seeing had cost them nearly 2 weeks of misreading. She'd been rotating the horses through field work, different animals on different days, learning which ones could handle the soft sections and which ones got anxious in them, which ones were useful and which were not yet. She'd started Copper later than the others because Copper required patience, and patience was something she'd had to ration carefully in the first 10 days when there's too much else to think about. But on the morning of day 13, she brought Copper into the northwest section of the field. The northwest section was the part of the field that worried her. The probe soundings there had been inconsistent, firm in some spots, soft in others, in ways that didn't quite map onto the pattern. She'd been building in her mind of where the roadbed ran and where the drain line ran. Something about the northwest section was different from the rest of the field. She didn't yet know what. She put Copper on a long lead and followed. For 10 minutes, Copper moved normally. The careful, deliberate step and check that characterized all of her movement, the gait of an animal that had learned never to assume that the next step was safe. Testing, choosing, making progress, then Copper stopped. Not the way a nervous horse stops, with the shudder and the snort and the sudden tight bodied readiness of an animal that smelled something wrong. This was different. Copper stopped the way a person stops when they've suddenly remembered something important. Feet all 4 planting at once. Weight settling. Body going very still. Clara waited. "Come on," she said quietly. Not a command. An invitation. Copper didn't move. Clara stepped up beside the horse and looked at the ground around them. It looked exactly the same as the ground they'd been honking for the past 10 minutes. Same coarse, yellow grass. Same flat surface. Same nothing in particular. She marked the spot with a stake. Walked Copper around it and forward, 20 feet further. Same thing, stop. Plant. Wait, she marked that spot. 2 hours later, she had 9 stakes in the northwest section and a growing understanding of something she should have seen sooner. Silas confirmed it with his probe. At every one of the 9 stopping points, the surface held, felt firm from above, the way the roadbed felt firm. But below it, at 8 inches, 10 inches, where the water should have drained through the lateral branches and into the main line, soft, saturated, the specific soft resistance of subsoil that had nowhere to go, 9 blocked lateral branches, not stopped sections of the main line. Laterals, smaller tile lines that branched off the main system and were supposed to pull water from the outer sections of the field and channel it toward the center. 9 of them in the northwest corner alone, either blocked by accumulated silt or damaged in some way that prevented them from draining. 9 sections of the field that would not support a corn crop through to harvest. Silas crouched beside one of the stakes and pressed the probe slowly, reading the resistance. "She's been in ground like this before," he said. He was looking at Copper, who had turned slightly to watch them with one dark eye. "The leg," Clara said. "The leg." he confirmed. She stepped wrong somewhere, probably young, probably on ground that looked solid from above and wasn't below. And she learned. He withdrew the probe. Not the way we learn things. But her body learned. Every time she's on ground that feels wrong to her weight, even when it looks right to her eyes, she stops. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the past 2 weeks. About every time Copper had stopped in the field, and she'd thought she was being stubborn. About every time she'd urged her forward and the mare had held firm, and she'd eventually given up and gone around. Every one of those stops. Every single one. She's been trying to tell us something, Clara said. Every time you thought she was difficult, every time, she looked at Copper. The horse held her gaze with that steady, patient expression that Clara had been misreading as stubbornness for 2 weeks. The specific expression of an animal that has been paying attention for a long time and has learned that if you wait long enough, the people you work with might eventually pay attention too. She wasn't being difficult. She was reading the ground. Reading it in the only way she knew how to read it. Through her feet, through the memory of the fall that had cost her, the use of one leg for whatever weeks it had taken to heal badly. Through the knowledge written into her body at cost. The most dangerous ground was the ground that looked safe. Copper knew this better than any of them. How many did we mark today? Clara said. 9, Silas said. 9 blocked laterals in the northwest section alone. 9 that we found today. He looked at her steadily. There may be more in sections we haven't walked with her yet. Clara looked at her chart, at the northwest section with its 9 new stakes. At the rest of the field still unmapped in this way. She did the arithmetic. If the northwest section, maybe 20% of the total field, was compromised by blocked laterals, the yield projections she'd been calculating were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that the margin she'd been counting on disappeared, and without a margin, any single additional problem could push the numbers below what she needed. We fix all of them, she said. All 9. Yes, in addition to the Stone Bend Junction, yes. Silas put his hands on his knees and calculated. Not out loud, but visibly, the way a man calculates when the numbers have implications for his back, and his timeline, and his 71-year-old body. Stone Bend first, he said. The laterals don't matter if the main junction doesn't run. Fix the heart first. Stone Bend first. Clara agreed. And then all 9, she went to Copper and put her hand flat on the mare's neck. The horse turned her head forward again. Ready. Day 28. Aldous Merritt rode out to the west field. He came alone. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Not his clerk beside him. Not any of the usual apparatus of a banker making an official visit. Just Merritt on his gray gelding, riding along the east fence line in the still morning. Stopping at the point where Silas and Clara had their tools laid out, and the probe marks dotted the ground like careful stitching. Clara was on her knees at the Stone Bend access point. They'd been excavating it for 3 days. Careful digging around the perimeter of the collapsed section, timber shoring the walls as they went so the surrounding ground, saturated, unstable, eager to fill any void that opened in it, didn't close back in on the work they'd done. 4 feet down. The dark clay of the field's subsoil, colder than the surface air, even on a hot morning, smelling of 30 years of water sitting where it shouldn't. She heard his horse before she heard him speak. The specific sound of a well-shod animal on the packed earth of the fence path, crisp, deliberate. The sound of money moving through a landscape. She looked up. Merritt looked down at her. She watched his expression adjust. Not change entirely. He was too controlled for that. Too practiced at keeping his face a professional instrument. But adjust in real time. To the gap between what he'd expected to find and what he was actually looking at. Her arms were black to the elbow, with the specific black of decades-deep clay. Her hair was plastered flat under the brim of her work hat. The excavation around her was not the work of someone trying something desperate and improvised. The timber shoring was precise and systematic. The pile of displaced material beside the access point represented many hours of effort by people who understood what they were doing. Mrs. Voss, he said, Mr. Merritt. She kept working, Pick up the canvas bucket. Scoop, transfer, set down. You're a long way from town. I heard you were making progress. He looked at the excavation, at the probe marks scattered across the ground around it, at the staked line that ran northeast from where he sat. What exactly is it that you're? Drainage repair, she said. My father's notes identified a blocked junction on the main tile line. We've exposed the collapse point and we're clearing the blockage. Silence. He was looking at the work. Not the idea of it. The actual evidence of 27 days of labor, the systematic approach made visible in the organization of the tools, and the precision of the shoring, and the careful way the excavation had been opened without disturbing more ground than necessary. She could feel him trying to fit what he was seeing into the category where he'd already filed her. The category wasn't holding. You're planning to drain the west field, he said, slowly. The way a man speaks when he's still processing information that arrived faster than his framework, could accommodate it, and then plant it in July. Yes, corn, late-season variety, short growth, 68 to 72 days to maturity. It's been done in this county before. Another silence. A different quality, not the silence of a man who hasn't understood, but of a man who has understood and is now calculating. If the drainage works, he said, and his voice had changed, drop the professional smoothness and picked up something more careful, and the ground responds the way you're expecting. What would your projected yield be? Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at him. She was 7 feet tall and on her knees in a hole, and he was on a horse, and she still had to look up at him, and she did it directly, without the slight angling away that people sometimes use to make a power differential less obvious. Enough to cover the note, she said. With margin, something moved across his face. Not the first cousin of respect. She'd seen the first cousin of respect on people's faces, and this was something earlier than that, something less formed. The beginning of the acknowledgement that an assessment might have been incomplete. He straightened in the saddle. August the 1st, Mrs. Voss, he said. I know the date, Mr. Merritt. He touched the brim of his hat, a professional gesture, not a personal one, and turned his horse and rode back along the fence line. Silas, who had been standing very still and very quiet at the edge of the excavation throughout this exchange, the trained stillness of a man who understood that his job in this moment was to not exist, waited until the hoofbeats had faded into the general morning sounds of the county. Then he looked down at Clara. He's worried, he said. Good, Clara said. She went back to scooping. The access point was ready on July 1st. This was the moment she'd been thinking about for 5 days. Thinking about, and deliberately not thinking about, holding it in peripheral vision while she focused on the excavation work itself. The way you hold a difficult conversation in peripheral vision while you handle the ordinary business of the day that precedes it. The opening was 18 inches wide, maybe 20 at its widest point, where the timber shoring had given them slightly more room than the surrounding clay pressure wanted to allow. It went down 4 feet to the level of the collapsed tile section and then angled into the horizontal channel where the actual blockage was. 4 feet of collapsed clay and the 30 years of packed silt and debris that had built up behind it. Silas stood at the edge and looked down. He didn't try to fit himself in. He was 71 years old, and he knew his own dimensions, the way a craftsman knows the dimensions of the tools he works with. And he'd known, for 3 days, that this opening was not for him. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at the opening she'd measured her shoulder width that morning, standing in the kitchen with a piece of string and a ruler. The string stretched between the outermost points of her shoulders, and the ruler held against it. 16.5 inches. The opening was 18. 1 inch of clearance on each side. She'd been in tight spaces before. Not this tight, not this dark, not with this particular smell of 30 years of organic material decomposing in standing water. But she'd learned, over 36 years of navigating a world built for smaller people, that tight spaces were manageable if you understood them. The problem with most tight spaces was not the tightness, but the panic that tightness provoked in people who weren't accustomed to it. She wasn't prone to panic. It was one of the few practical advantages of a life spent moving carefully through spaces that didn't quite fit. "You'll talk me through it," she said to Silas. "Not a question." "Every step," he said. "I've done this kind of work many times. From outside the shaft. I'll tell you exactly what to expect and exactly what to do. You've directed other people through it. Younger people. Smaller people." A pause. "Never someone who moved the way you move. I'll move differently in there." "Yes," he said. "You will." She took off her work coat, folded it and set it on the timber stack, rolled her sleeves to the elbow, tied her hair back tighter, checked the small lantern that Silas would lower down after her on a rope, checked the canvas bucket. She'd go in through the horizontal channel, and the bucket would travel back and forth through the access shaft on a second rope. She looked at the opening one final time. 16.5 inches into 18 inches, 1 inch of clearance on each side. It's fine, she thought. It's absolutely. She went in. The smell hit her first. Not rot exactly. The specific smell of time. Of water that had been standing in a sealed space for 30 years. Developing the particular chemistry of enclosed stagnant places. Wet clay. Decomposed organic material. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with the July air on the surface above her. She moved slowly, arms forward, elbows bent, the way Silas had told her. Hands doing the work of feeling what the lantern's small light didn't fully illuminate. The timber shoring of the access shaft was on either side of her shoulders, close enough that she could feel the grain of it through her shirt. "You're at 3 feet, Silas's voice came from above, even and steady. The voice of a man who understood that the most important thing his voice could be right now was a consistent signal. "The angle shifts left here. You'll feel the timber give way to clay on your right shoulder." She felt it. "Yes." "Good. Now the channel opens slightly. Another 8 inches of width. You'll be able to move your arms more freely." She tested it. He was right. Not comfortable. Nothing about this was comfortable, but workable. There was room to bring the smaller trowel to bear. "What am I looking for?" she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, compressed. "The acoustics of a narrow underground space. The tile ends about 2 feet ahead of you. Smooth clay surface, curved, roughly 4 inches in diameter. When you reach the break, the surface becomes rough, fractured edges going in different directions. That's where the collapse starts." She moved forward, felt the tile, smooth under her fingers, just as he'd described. Felt where it changed. "I'm at the collapse," she said. A pause from above. The pause of a man breathing carefully. "All right," Silas said. "The plug behind it, the accumulated material, is packed hardest at the face. The first 6 inches will be the most difficult. After that it loosens. Short strokes with the trowel. Don't try to clear large sections at once." "Short strokes," she said. "Put each handful in the bucket before it can fall back into the space you've just cleared. Move it backward toward the shaft. Keep the working space open. Short strokes fill the bucket. Move it back." She started day 1 underground, day 2 underground. Day 3. She lost count of the buckets sometime in the afternoon of the second day and stopped trying to count them. She stopped trying to track the hours. She stopped thinking about anything except the immediate next action. Stroke of the trowel, transfer the loosened material, pass the bucket back, receive the empty one. Silas's voice came down at intervals, even when there was nothing specific to say. Just checking, just making sure she was still there. On the second day, she heard other voices above. Heavier footsteps than Silas's. The sounds of timber being moved, Falk. She recognized his voice eventually. The specific timbre of it, lower than Silas's, gruffer, with slight discomfort of a man who had arrived somewhere with something to do and wasn't sure how to announce himself. "Taya said you needed shoring on the east section." Silas's voice. "Second section north of the stakes." A pause. "She's in there?" Falk said. "Now? She's been in there since yesterday morning." Silence. Then the sounds of a man getting to work. Clara said nothing. She kept working. Short stroke. Fill the bucket. Move it back. On the afternoon of the third day, the material she was moving began to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. but the texture of it shifted, from the dense compressed resistance of material that had been packed down for decades to something slightly looser, slightly more willing to come away from the face of the blockage. The short strokes were moving more material per stroke. The packed face was becoming less uniformly packed. And then she wasn't certain she was reading it correctly. Wasn't certain that 3 days underground hadn't changed her perception of things. Something changed in the air pressure around her. Not wind, not movement, but a quality to the air that was different from what it had been. As if the space behind the blockage, sealed for 30 years, had begun to remember that it was connected to somewhere. "Silas," she said, his voice instantly. "Here, I think I'm through the main plug." A longer silence than usual. "Can you feel any change in the space behind where you've been working? Any change in pressure or air quality?" She pressed her hand flat against the clay wall. "Something. Faint. The specific quality of air that has been held in place for a very long time and is beginning to move." "Yes," she said. Above ground, she heard Silas make a sound that wasn't words. Just a sound. The sound of a man who has been carrying something in his chest for a long time and has just felt the weight of it shift. "Keep going," he said. 5 more minutes. She kept going. The tile from Cheyenne arrived on July 5th. 4 days of freight, which was what Silas had calculated when sent the order on July 1st, before she'd gone into the shaft. Before the clearing was done, before they'd confirmed that the clearing would work. He'd ordered the tile based on the hypothesis that it would be needed, which was the behavior of a man who understood that preparation and Shipwunch faith were, in the practical work of drainage, essentially the same thing. Clara found this out afterward, that he'd ordered it before they knew. She didn't know what to do with it, exactly, with being believed in, so specifically, by someone who had no particular obligation to believe in her, except that he'd watched her and made a judgment. She filed it away. There was too much work to feel things properly. Silas laid the new tile on July 5th and 6th. This was the work that fit him the way. The handle of the probe fit his palm. The specific intersection of knowledge and physical skill that 50 years of doing this exact kind of work had built in him. He knew the angle of grade required. He knew how each section of tile needed to seat against the next. He knew how to read the surviving sections of the original system for information about what the builder in the 1850s had intended. Clara worked beside him, not because he needed her to, because she'd decided somewhere in the 3 days underground that she was going to understand this system completely before she was done with it. Not just know that it was there. Not just be grateful when it worked. Understand it, the way you understand something when you might need to fix it yourself in 10 years. Alone, without the man who taught you. She asked questions. Silas answered them without shortening the answers. She remembered everything. Jolly 8th. Before the heat, Silas pushed the probe into the earth 8 feet upfield of the Stone Bend Junction, and withdrew it, and looked at it and looked at Clara. "Dry," he said. Clara pressed her palms flat against her thighs. "It's draining," she said. "Not a question, it's draining." She pushed her boot into the earth beside the junction. Still soft, of course, still soft. 30 years of standing water doesn't leave in a morning. But different, less absolute. The softness of something that was in the process of becoming something else, rather than the softness of something that had simply always been wrong. "How long before the field is workable?" she said. Silas studied the sky, the ground, the sky again. 2 weeks before you can bring a horse across it with a real load. 3 before a cedar won't track deep. That puts planting at around July 27th, if the drought holds. The drought's held for 6 weeks, I know. He almost smiled. It was the specific almost smile of a man who understands irony. For once it's working for us. Every dry day pulls more water out of that subsoil faster than rain would put it back. She looked at the west field, the 100 acres of yellow grass, except not quite the same yellow it had been a month ago. Slightly different in the sections directly above the drain line. Not dramatically different, but different enough that she could see it if she was looking for it, which she was. She thought about her father. About 20 years of walking to the eastern fence, and looking at this field, and knowing what it needed, and not being able to give it. She let herself feel that for 4 seconds, then she went back to work. On July 12th, she walked copper through the northwest section, systematically, row by row through the coarse grass. The second probe pass over the territory they'd already mapped, this time looking specifically for the blocked laterals rather than the main line. Copper stopped 9 times on the first pass. Clara marked the spots. On the second pass, slightly offset from the first, Copper stopped at 7 of the 9 previous spots and 2 new ones. 11 total. She mapped them that evening on the kitchen table, the lantern making her shadow large on the wall behind her. The pattern was visible in the mapping, a cluster of blockages in the northwest section, concentrated in the area furthest from the Stone Bend Junction. The area where the tile was oldest, the area where the water had been sitting longest, and the ground pressure on the buried system had been greatest for the most continuous period, 11 sections. Some small, 20 feet, 30 feet, some larger. Total, 4 or 5 acres across the northwest corner. 4 or 5 acres of corn that, if the lateral stayed blocked, would reach full ear. She did the new arithmetic, the numbers came out worse than before. Not impossible. But the margin she'd been counting on was gone. Any additional problem, any single thing that went wrong between now and September the 1st, and the yield projections fell below what she needed. She wrote at the bottom of her chart, fix all 11. Then she wrote the date she needed to have them fixed by. Then she looked at what remained between that date and now. Possible. Very close. Very dependent on nothing else going wrong. She went to bed. Silas started on the lateral blockages, July 15th. This was different work from the Stone Bend Junction. The laterals were smaller tile, smaller access points, shorter blockages of accumulated silt, rather than the catastrophic structural collapse they dealt with at the main junction. Each one individually manageable. 11 of them collectively was a different question. Clara worked alongside him every morning. In the wet heat of late July, with the particular exhaustion of work that can't be done slowly because something depends on it being done fast. Tobias Falk was there most days now. He'd started coming out to check whether anything needed doing and had graduated, without any formal arrangement being made, into doing whatever needed to be done. He was 19 and quiet in the useful way. He didn't talk when he was working, which meant he wasn't spending energy on anything except the work. His friend James came with him on the 4th day. Arlen Briggs's youngest son, 17, who had apparently heard about what was happening on the west field and had decided he wanted to be part of it. He didn't ask permission. He just showed up with Tobias one morning and got to work. And when Clara looked at him, he met her eyes directly and nodded once, which she took as the extent of the explanation on offer. She took it. 4 people in the wet work of late July. The particular exhaustion of work that is also urgent, that doesn't have the luxury of slowing down. Orrin Falk came back on July 18th, not to watch. Not to check on things from a distance with the politely skeptical expression she'd seen on his face for the past 6 weeks. He came with his wagon, and in the wagon were 2 of the men who worked for him in the store, and a covered basket that, when he set it on the tailgate, released the smell of actual cooked food. Biscuits, ham, something with onions that someone had spent time on. He stood by the wagon with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way that people turn things when they're saying something, with their hands that they can't quite manage with their mouths. Clara looked at him. Then at the wagon. Then at him. The fence line on your north section, he said. 2 posts are loose. I noticed them when I rode past last week. My neighbor's cattle have been pushing against that section. She looked at the fence. She looked at Falk. Orrin. What? You don't have to do this. I know I don't. He didn't look away. She'd expected him to look away. My wife made biscuits. She made too many. And my man Welter needs somewhere to put his energy, because he broke 2 things in the store this week, and I need him somewhere that doesn't have breakable things in it. A beat. All she said. I laughed. The word landed quietly in the space between them, not followed by explanation, not hedged with justification, just the word itself. The acknowledgement of a specific thing that had happened on a specific morning in June in his store, with 2 ranchers watching and a young cowhand watching and Falk himself responding before his manners could respond for him. He'd laughed, and he was here now with fence posts, biscuits, and 2 of his men, and the laughing was the reason, even if he couldn't quite say it that directly. Clara looked at him for a moment longer. "The north fence," she said. "Silas will show your men where the posts are loose." He nodded, put his hat back on, went to find Silas. At midday, they ate in the shade of Falk's wagon. Clara and Silas and Tobias and James and Falk and his 2 men, 7 people in the shade of a wagon in a drought year in Wyoming, eating biscuits and not talking very much, which was its own kind of conversation. The third lateral from the west. Northwest corner, July 22nd. Silas and Tobias were in the excavation. Silas directing, Tobias doing the clearing. James managing the rope system at the surface, keeping the silt buckets moving. Clara was moving between the excavations, checking progress at each one, when she heard Silas's voice come up from the third different quality. Quieter. Careful in the way of someone choosing how to say something they don't want to say, Clara. Come down. She climbed down. The excavation was narrow, barely room for 2 people. Silas was crouched at tile level with his lantern close to the wall, and what the light showed stopped her. The tile at this lateral junction wasn't blocked. It was collapsed. Not a 4-foot section, like at Stone Bend. Longer. She could see the break running east into the clay wall of the excavation, and the break didn't end at the edge of what they'd opened. It continued. Into ground they hadn't touched yet. Into ground she couldn't see. How far does it go? She said. I don't know. He kept his voice even. 6 feet minimum, could be 12. He looked at her. If it's 12 feet, we can't lay new tile in time with what's left from the Cheyenne order. I used the last of it on the second lateral yesterday. Clara sat in the bottom of the wet excavation. She sat with the information. Let it arrive and settle rather than reacting to it while it was still arriving. The information was 12 feet of collapsed lateral tile in the northwest corner of the field, which required new tile, which required freight time, which required days she had narrowly calculated she did not have to spare. Options, she said, Silas thought. He was a man who didn't rush his thinking, and she'd learned over the past month not to rush it for him. What came out of Silas Breck's thinking was usually worth waiting for. Cheyenne again, he said. 4 days freight if they ship same day. That leaves us 10 days to lay and backfill before you need to have the northwest section planted. Possible? Barely. Other option. Denver supplier. Faster freight line. 2 days. Maybe 3. He paused. More expensive. How much more? He told her. The number was the difference between meeting the banknote with a margin and meeting it with nothing. No winter feed money. No operating buffer. Meeting it exactly and precisely, on September the 1st with $12 left over, and nothing more, $12, which was not nothing. $12 was a month's supply of basics, if you were careful. But it was also not enough if anything else went wrong between September the 1st and the first frost, and something always went wrong between a deadline and the first frost. The ranching calendar was not constructed to avoid additional problems. She thought about copper. About the way the horse planted her feet on ground that looked solid but wasn't. The wisdom of an animal that had learned, at cost, not to trust surfaces that hadn't earned trust yet. She thought about the cheaper option. About trusting a surface that couldn't hold Denver, she said. Premium freight. She climbed out of the excavation. James, she said. He was there in seconds. Ride to the telegraph office. I'll write the wire. As fast as you can get there. He was on his horse before she finished the sentence. Falk showed up that same afternoon. Clara looked up from the surface work and saw his wagon at the east fence and thought, genuinely, for one full second, that she was imagining it. She'd seen him 3 days ago. He had no reason to be here again. He climbed down. Heard you had a collapse in the northwest section, he said. She looked at him, then at his wagon. The bed of it had timber, Good timber, the right dimensions for shoring, and tile sections of the wrong size but something. How did you hear? James Briggs came through town for the telegraph. A combination of sheepishness and dignity crossed his face. The boy cannot keep anything to himself. It's actually remarkable how fast information moves when he's involved, Orrin. The tile is the wrong size. I know the tile is the wrong size. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. But I sent a wire to a supplier in Laramie this morning. Different dimensions than Denver. Close enough that Silas might be able to make it work on the outer sections of the collapse while you wait for the right size on the junction. He handed her the paper. They can have it here in 3 days. Clara looked at the paper, at the specifications, at the delivery date. She looked at Falk. You wired Laramie this morning, she said. Before James got to the telegraph office, he turned his hat. I have a nephew who works freight out of Laramie. I've been keeping track of your tile orders, I thought. He stopped. Restarted. I thought that if there was another collapse, I might be able to do something useful. In case, she thought. 2 words that meant, I decided what kind of person I wanted to be when it mattered, and I prepared for that moment. And this is what it looks like when it arrives. The outer sections, she said slowly. If Silas can adapt the grade, that's what I thought. I'll ask him. She went to the excavation. Passed the specifications down to Silas. Waited silence from below. Longer than she expected. Then, the outer 3 sections. Yes, it won't be standard grade, but it'll run. Another pause. Tell Falk that was a good thought. Clara straightened. Looked at Falk, who was standing 10 feet away with the expression of a man doing his best not to look like he'd been listening. He says it was a good thought, she said. Falk looked at something in the middle distance. Nodded once. Right, he said. Let's get the timber set. The next 4 days were the most compressed thing Clara had ever lived through, including the 3 days in the drainage shaft. Because those days had been brutal in a specific, singular way, all her attention on one problem, one direction, one task. These 4 days were everything at once. Denver tile arriving on day 2. Silas laying the junction sections with the precision of a man who had been doing exactly this kind of work for half a century and was not going to do it badly just because his back was expressing strong opinions about the position required. Laramie tile arriving on day 3. Silas adapting the grade on the outer sections, not guessing, not improvising randomly, but applying deep knowledge to an unexpected constraint. The way a craftsman applies everything he knows to a problem that isn't quite the problem he prepared for. Tobias and James moving earth. The specific energy of young men who had found, in the emergency of the situation, a sense of purpose that surprised them and kept them working past the point where they thought they could. Falk's 2 men shoring and hauling without being asked twice about anything. Clara everywhere. On the surface, in the excavations, running the arithmetic in the background of everything else, making decisions before she had all the information. Because waiting for all the information had always been, in her experience, the same as making no decision at all. On the evening of the 4th day, Silas climbed out of the last excavation. He straightened, as much as his back permitted, which was less than it had been at the beginning of June, and said, The last section is running. Clara stopped moving. She was holding a bucket. She set it down, all of them, she said, every lateral on the line. The main junction, the whole system. Running, she pressed her boot into the earth of the northwest section. Soft. Still soft, of course, still soft. But a different soft from the soft it had been a month ago. The soft of ground that was in the process of changing, rather than the soft of ground that had been wrong for 30 years, and had stopped trying to be anything else. 2 weeks before it's plantable, Silas said. July 27th to August 10th. She said. She'd been tracking the days so continuously that the arithmetic happened before she knew she was doing it. Planting window opens August 10th at the earliest, 21 days to plant, she said. And then the ground does the rest before September the 1st. That's the deadline, Silas said. That's the deadline. Her mind had been somewhere else for a moment. Yes, merit. She looked out at the west field, the 100 acres of yellow-green grass, which was, she could see it now clearly, in the evening light beginning to change, not dramatically, not overnight, but changing. The color shifting in the sections directly above the main drain line. The specific yellow-green of grass growing in wrong water, saturated ground giving way, in patches, to something slightly different. Something that contained the beginning of a different possibility. "Tomorrow morning," she said to Silas. "Before anything else, bring Copper out, to the northwest section. I want to see how she walks it now, that it's running." She looked at him. "I want to see if she notices." Silas considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that were, on the surface, small. "That's a good thing to know," he said. "Before you plant." "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked back toward the barn in the gathering dark. Copper came to the fence when she heard Clara's footsteps. Not with the eagerness of a horse expecting food, with the particular alert attention of an animal that has learned, through long practice, that paying attention is the most useful thing she does, ears forward. Head slightly tilted. "Tomorrow," Clara told her. Copper blinked, then went back to grazing. With the specific contentment, Clara had learned to read it by now. The difference between Copper's contentment and her wariness. The difference between her deliberate stillness and her ready stillness. Of an animal who has found, in an unexpected place, ground she can trust. The morning of July 28th, Clara brought Copper to the west field before anyone else arrived, just the two of them. Before Silas, before Tobias or James, before the day's work had a shape yet. She unlatched the gate and stepped back. Copper walked in, Clara watched. The mare moved the way she always moved. That careful, deliberate step and check, testing the surface before committing weight, head slightly lowered. The gait of an animal that had learned never to assume the ground would hold. She moved northeast, into the section that had most recently been draining. Into the area above the laterals they'd fixed last. Into the ground where, 2 weeks ago, she'd planted her feet and refused to move. She walked through it, not fast, not carelessly, but steadily, without the planted stops, without the refusals. One hoof, then the next, finding the ground and trusting what she found and moving forward. She stopped once. Near the third lateral, the one that had collapsed, the one that had taken the extra tile and the extra days. She stopped there for 4 seconds, testing, checking, then she moved on. Clara stood at the gate and felt something she'd been keeping managed for 61 days. She let it be there. Just for a moment, then she went to get Silas. She walked the northwest section, Clara said when he arrived. Silas looked at the field. At Copper moving steadily through the northeast end now, her iron-gray coat catching the early morning light. She stopped once, Clara said, near the third lateral, for about 4 seconds. Then kept going. Silas watched the mare for a long time. "She remembers where it was," he said finally, "even after we fixed it. The specific location," he paused, "but she tested it, and when it held, she moved on," Clara said. "Yes." They stood in the quiet of the early morning, the field around them. The stakes still in the ground from the mapping, and the lateral work, the timber shoring visible at the excavation sites, the evidence of 2 months of work visible in every direction. "The ground is ready," Silas said. "The ground is ready," Clara confirmed. She went to get the cedar her father had built, the cedar himself, iron frame. Wooden handles worn smooth by 30 years of his palms. A single-row implement, hand-pushed, designed for the specific conditions of Voss Ranch bottomland. The depth of placement, the spacing, the way the bottom soil closed, over a planted seed differently from upland soil. She had oiled it 3 times in the past week, not because it needed 3 oilings, because doing something useful with her hands kept her from doing the arithmetic she couldn't stop doing in her head. 21 days to plant. 68 to 72 days to maturity for the short-season variety. Planting on July 28th gave her, in the best case, with the drought holding and the bottom land moisture, doing what she believed it would do, until the 1st or 2nd week of October, before she needed harvestable ears. The first frost in Harlan County typically arrived in late September or early October. The margins were real. The margins were also very tight. She oiled the cedar a fourth time on the evening of July 27th and then put the oil can away and made herself stop. The cedar was ready. She was ready. The field was ready, all three at once, for the first time since June the 1st. She went in, July 28th, first row at 5:40 in the morning. The soil closed over each seed with a feel she was learning to read. Not the resistance of upland soil, the argument it makes with whatever you put in it. Something different. The bottomland soil. 30 years of organic material accumulated in the wrong water saturation, now draining properly. Now aerated for the first time in 3 decades. The soil that received the seed, the way you receive something you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She planted until the heat drove her off at 9, went back at 4, planted until dark, slept 5 hours, did it again. Tobias appeared at the field gate on the 3rd morning. He had a horse and a second cedar. Older than Clara's, rougher in its action, but functional. He had a note from Orrin Falk. He says he wants to help. I said that was all right. Orrin Clara read it twice. Looked at Tobias, looked at the cedar. You know how to manage a horse in soft ground, she said. Yes, ma'am. You know you don't push through when the animal hesitates. Yes, ma'am. You follow the marked rows, and you don't cut corners because the surface looks firm. Yes, ma'am. She handed him a seed bag. Get started, she said. Tobias planted beside her for 6 days without being asked to come back each time. He didn't talk while he worked. He did exactly what the work required, and nothing that it didn't. On the 4th day, James appeared beside him, and then there were 4 of them. Clara and Silas, and 2 young men who had grown up hearing the Westfield called dead, pushing seed into ground that was answering, row by row. With the quiet certainty of soil that had finally been given what it needed, the planting finished on August 15th. 4 days ahead of the deadline she once set herself, which should have felt like exhaling, which should have felt like something solid under her feet after weeks of soft ground. Instead, it felt like the top of a long climb, the moment when you can see how far you still have to fall. The seeds were in the ground. Now the ground had to answer. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with her father's journal open in front of her. She didn't read it, she just sat with it. The way you sit with someone you've been missing, not needing conversation, just needing the presence. After a while, she said out loud to the empty kitchen, I gave it a direction, Papa. The water has a direction now. The kitchen didn't answer. But in the morning, when she walked the field at first light before the heat rose, she found it at the leading edge of the first row, a tiny pale green curve of stem, no bigger than a thumbnail, pushing up through the dark bottomland earth, like it had somewhere important to be. She stood over it for a long time, then she went back to work. The corn came up. It came up the way things grow when the soil is genuinely right. Not the desperate, thin growth of plants fighting bad ground. Not the yellow-edged struggle of crops in drought-hit upland fields that were getting too little water from too little rain. The thick-stemmed emergence of plantfa that have found everything they need exactly where they're standing. By August 8th, the rows were visible across the entire field. Green lines against dark earth. Organized, deliberate, the evidence of 3 weeks of planting, and the much longer work that had made the planting possible. By August 12th, knee-high, around them, the drought tightened on the county like a fist. The other farms in Harlan County watched their summer corn stall. Stalks yellowing at the edges, ears setting but not filling. The creek at its lowest point since 1871. Walt Heater's granary filling slowly from a harvest that was coming in, short everywhere else. Clara's Westfield looked like it was operating under different weather, which, in a way, it was. The bottom land soil, 30 years of organic material accumulated in the wrong water saturation, now draining properly. Now alive in a way that upland soil in a drought year simply couldn't match. Held moisture at the root zone, in a way that had nothing to do with rain. The corn didn't need the sky to cooperate. It had what it needed underground. in the water that had been sitting wrong for 30 years and was now, finally, distributed correctly, not trapped in the subsoil, but accessible to roots. Available in the way that plants need water to be available, it grew, like it was making up for lost time. She tried not to watch it too closely. It felt dangerous to pay too much attention to a thing that could still fail. The ears weren't set. The silk wasn't dry. 68 days from planting meant full maturity around the 1st of October, which was possible in this part of Wyoming and was also historically 1 week after the average frost date for Harlan County. 1 week's margin between a successful harvest and losing it all to cold. She tried not to think about that number. Other people were watching, though. Orrin Falk came to the field fence on October 14th. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. Clara saw him from the far end and kept working. When she came back toward the gate, he was still there. Hat in his hands, looking at the corn with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the skepticism of June, not the discomfort of the fence post afternoon, but something quieter and less easily named. That's the tallest corn in Harlan County. He said, I know, by a significant amount, I know. Orrin. He turned his hat. Merritt came into the store yesterday, bought a bag of oats. He stood at my window for a while. A pause. Looking this direction, Clara felt something cold move through her, despite the August heat. How many days left, Falk said. Not a question, just a man confirming that she knew what she knew. 18, she said. She always knew the number. He looked at the field. The corn was tall, dark green against the drought-pale landscape on every side of it. But tall corn and harvestable corn were different things. You think you'll have yield by the 31st? She looked at the corn carefully. Into it rather than at it. The ear formation in the south section, visible, advanced, the silk already browning at the tips. The energy in the plant had shifted from climbing to filling. The south section. Yes, she said. Enough to put a number on paper that holds up. He was quiet. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What, June? My store. When you asked for the names, he looked at her directly. I laughed. Not loud, but I laughed, and I made sure the whole county knew what I thought, Orrin. I should have. You gave me the names, she said. Nonchalantly, firmly. That was what I asked for, and that was what I needed, and the rest of it is finished. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his particular form of respect. Uncomfortable. Genuine, not quite able to carry itself without spilling something. If there's anything else I can do, he said. Actually, yes. She looked at him directly. I need 3 men with wagons on September 1st for the harvest. Fair wages, he nodded immediately. Done, I'll have them here. She watched him walk back to his horse. She had been angry at Orrin Falk for 2 months, quietly, sustainedly angry in the way she was angry at things, without making a production of it, but also without forgetting it. Standing at her fence in the August heat, watching his wagon start back toward town, she noticed that the anger had moved somewhere else. While she wasn't paying attention, left behind something more complicated and more useful, she went back to the field. The first disaster came on August 17th. She was checking the north section at dawn when she found it. A section of the field, roughly 20 feet across, where the corn had stopped, not dying. Not yellowing at the edges the way drought-stressed corn yellowed. Just stopped. Frozen at about 2/3 the height of everything around it, sitting still while the rest of the field continued its work of becoming. Her chest tightened. She stood in the middle of the stopped section and felt the arithmetic shift in the way it shifted when a new variable appeared. Not collapsing, not yet, but rearranging. She called Silas. He came across the field with the deliberate walk he'd had since his back started expressing opinions earlier in the month. The walk of a man who has made a negotiated peace with his body's limitations and intends to honor the terms. He stopped beside her, looked at the stopped section, took out his probe at the edge, firm at 14 inches, normal at the center, soft resistance at 11 inches. The probe came back damp, lateral, he said, a section that's not running. The main line is clear, but there's a branch somewhere under this section that's still blocked. I thought we got all 11, Clara said. We got the 11 Copper found. He looked at her steadily. There may be more. She looked at the horses in the south pasture, looked at Copper specifically. The same way we found the others, Silas said. She walked Copper through the corn. This was different from the earlier field work. The stalks were tall enough now that they were moving through the corn, rather than over it, the leaves brushing Clara's shoulders, the ears forming above her head. The gray mare moved between the rows with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. Like an animal that understood the delicacy the situation required row 1. Nothing row 2, nothing row 3 from the west. Copper stopped, Clara marked it. 3 hours, every row, methodical and without hurrying, because hurrying would mean missing something. 8 total stops, including the first one she'd found. When she mapped them on her chart that evening, the pattern was visible, not random, but concentrated. The area furthest from the Stone Bend Junction, the oldest tile. The sections that had been under the most continuous pressure for the longest time, maybe 2 acres scattered through the field. The yield from the healthy sections was still enough to cover the note. Barely. If drought pricing held, and she was certain it would hold, because 3 families in this county were going to need to buy grain this winter, and the supply from everywhere else was thin, but barely meant no margin, and no margin meant that what happened next mattered completely. We fixed them, she told Silas the next morning. All 8? 5 days, he said. Maybe 6. She had 11 days until September the 1st. Do it. What do you need? Tobias and James. Someone managing the horses while we're in the excavations. She looked at Silas, the forward lean he'd developed over the past 2 weeks, the small accommodations his body was making against his explicit instructions. You're back, she said. We'll hold, Silas. We'll hold. I didn't come out here in June to stop at the hard part. She held his gaze for a moment. This old man. His calloused hands, and his iron probe, and his 50 years of making water go where it belonged. His 8 months of guilt about a conversation he hadn't had with her father. His willingness, at 71, to be in an excavation in August heat. Because the work wasn't finished. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said, which was what the men of Harlan County said when they meant it. They found the second disaster on the 4th day, Silas and Tobias, in the 3rd excavation, northwest corner, the deepest and the wettest. Clara at the surface when she heard Silas's voice come up with that different quality. The careful quality of a man who has something to say that he'd rather not say. Clara. Come down. She climbed down. The tile at this junction wasn't blocked with silt. It was collapsed. The break ran east into the clay wall of the excavation and kept going. Into ground they hadn't opened. The collapse extended beyond what they could see. How far, she said, 8 feet minimum. Could be 12. 7 days before September the 1st, freight minimum from Denver. 3 days to lay and backfill. 3 days was not enough. She sat in the wet clay and held this, let it land. Absorbed the weight of it. Then, options, Silas thought. He never rushed his thinking. Wired today. Premium freight. 2 days. 5 days to lay and backfill. It's tight. Cost. He told her the number that left $12 to her name after paying the note. $12. She thought about copper. About ground that looked solid but wasn't. About the cost of trusting a surface that hadn't earned trust. Denver. Premium freight. She climbed out. James. He was there, in seconds. Telegraph office. I'll write the wire. Now, he rode. Volkswagen appeared at the east fence that same afternoon. She looked up and genuinely thought for a moment that she was imagining it. He'd been out twice already this week. Heard you had another collapse, he said. James Briggs, he confirmed. The boy is constitutionally incapable of keeping anything to himself. It's actually a remarkable quality. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. I sent a wire to a Laramie supplier this morning. Different size than Denver. Similar enough that Silas might be able to use it on the outer sections while you wait for the right size on the junction. He handed her the paper. 3 days. Clara looked at the delivery date. Looked at Falk. You wired Laramie before James got to the telegraph office, she said. I have a nephew who works freight out of Laramie. I've been keeping track of your tile orders." He turned his hat. In case. Clara looked at the specifications, called down to Silas, passed them through silence, then the outer 3 sections. "Yes, it won't be standard, but it'll run." A pause. "Tell Falk that was a good thought." She looked up at Falk, who was 10 feet away, with the expression of someone who absolutely had not been listening. "He says it was a good thought," she said. Falk nodded once, looked at something distant that wasn't there. "Right," he said. "Let's get the timber set." The next 4 days were the most compressed thing Clara had ever lived through, including the 3 days in the shaft. Those days had been brutal in a specific and singular way. All of her attention on one problem, one direction, one task, and nothing else required of her except the next short stroke and the next bucket. Those days had been exhausting in the way of physical work that is simply and purely hard. These 4 days were different. These days were everything at once. Denver Tile arriving on day 2 of waiting. Silas laying the junction sections with the deliberateness of a man who has done exactly this kind of work for the better part of 50 years, and understands that speed and precision are not the same thing, and that in drainage work, precision is the one that matters. His back had its opinions. He worked through them. Laramie Tile arriving on day 3. Silas adapting the grade on the outer sections of the collapsed lateral. Not improvising in the way of a man guessing, but improvising in the way of a craftsman, applying deep knowledge to a constraint that was different from the one he'd prepared for. Working out, in the moment, what the correct adjustment was, and making it with the confidence of someone who understood the principles well enough to modify the applications. Tobias and James moving earth, with the energy of young men who had found, somewhere in the emergency of the situation, a sense of purpose that was larger than what they'd expected to find when they showed up that first morning. Falk's shoring and hauling. Falk himself doing whatever nobody else was doing, without commentary, without the need to be asked twice. Clara everywhere. On the surface between excavations. Down in the excavations when an extra pair of hands was what was needed. Running the arithmetic in the background of every other thing. Adjusting the projections as each day resolved. Making decisions before the information was complete, because waiting for complete information was a way of not deciding, and not deciding was its own kind of decision. On the evening of the 4th day, Silas climbed out of the last excavation. He straightened, as much as his back was permitting at this point, which was less than it had been in June, and said, "The last section is running." Clara stopped moving. She was carrying a bucket. She set it down carefully, the way you set something down, when you want to do it right even though your hands want to drop it. "All of them," she said. "Every lateral on the line. The main junction. The whole system." She looked at the corn in the fading August light. The northwest section. The blocked section. The stopped section. The section she'd been most worried about. Was still shorter than everything around it. Of course it was. 4 days of proper drainage wasn't going to reverse what 30 years of wrong water growth had done to those plants. She hadn't expected it to, but she needed to see what those 4 days had done. She needed to walk the rows tonight before she could sleep, because sleeping without knowing was impossible. "Tonight," she said. Silas looked at her with the look of a man who has been working alongside her for 8 weeks, and has learned which of her decisions are negotiable and which aren't. He got his lantern. They walked the northwest section together in the dark, the lantern making a small circle of light ahead of them. The corn closing in on either side, taller than Clara's waist now, the ears forming above her in the darkness, visible only as shapes against the early stars. The stopped corn was still shorter than the rest. Still. Of course still. But the stalks were stiffening. That was what she was looking for. The specific quality of a plant that has stopped fighting its environment and has started using its energy for growth instead of survival. She reached up and touched the silk at the top of the nearest ear. Not dried. Still fresh. Still receiving. Time. Not much, but time. "Will they fill?" she said. Silas put his hand on a stalk, felt the stem, felt the ear formation. Some of them, he said. Not all. But some. A pause. I think you have enough. If the weather holds and nothing else goes wrong, I think you have enough. She nodded. She turned off the lantern. Because they needed to save the oil, and because she needed a moment in the dark where no one could see her face. They walked back through the field in silence, their feet finding the crowned roadbed without needing to see it, because by now they knew where it was. It had become part of how they moved through this field. The road lived in their feet. At the gate, Silas stopped. Clara, he said. She turned. Your father laid the original tile on this field, he said. The main line. Did you know that? She went very still. What? He was young. 22, maybe 23. He hired out to the man who owned this land before your grandfather bought it. Spent 2 summers laying the main line. Silas looked at the ground, the way he looked at the ground when he was looking at something that wasn't visible from the surface. I worked alongside him on the 2nd summer. That's how I knew him, before I knew him as August Voss the rancher. I knew him first as the young man who understood how water moved through earth. Clara stood very still. You never told me that, she said. You never asked. He looked up at her. And it didn't seem like the right thing to say until the work was done. Until it was worth saying. She thought about her father at 22. In this field. Laying tile in summer heat before this was his land, before any of it was his. Just a young man doing hired work, learning the ground. She thought about him at 60, sitting by the east window in October, with his boots still on. Watching this same field from the distance of a life that had happened between then and now. She thought about what it meant to spend 40 years watching something you'd built with your own hands fail, slowly. And whether he had known, in those 3 shaking lines at the back of the journal. Whether he had suspected that someone would come after him and finish it. She thought he probably had. She thought that was exactly what he'd intended. Thank you, Silas, she said. For telling me, he nodded once. I'm going home to sleep, for approximately 3 days, he said. Send Tobias, if you need anything, before September the 1st. She watched him walk to his horse. Slow and deliberate. A man who had given everything he had and was carrying every year of it simultaneously. He mounted, rode toward the east gate. Did not look back, because Silas Breck was not a man who looked back at things he'd finished. She went inside. Did the final arithmetic one more time. At the kitchen table, with the lantern and the pencil and the paper that had been accumulating numbers for just 2 months, full yield sections. Partial yield sections from the northwest corner that would contribute something even if not everything. Price per bushel at drought year rates, which would be higher than normal years because everyone in the county was coming up short. Transportation to the granary. Merritt's note amount. Denver tile premium. Laramie tile. Silas's wages. Paid in full because that was what they'd agreed and she intended to honor agreements. She added it twice, got the same number both times, set the pencil down. It was enough. Barely. Exactly. With $12 remaining. But enough, she closed the journal, put her hands flat on the table. Outside, the west field was dark and the corn was growing. 6 days until September. The 1st, she went to sleep. The corn kept growing. Days 19 and 20 after planting had brought the south section to knee height. Days 25 through 30 had pushed it past her waist. By August 25th, it was at her shoulder, which, given that she was 7 feet tall, meant it was taller than almost anyone else in Harlingen County could reach standing on their toes. It grew like it was making up for something, which, in a sense, it was. The bottom land soil, 30 years of organic accumulation, now draining correctly, now exchanging water with the root zone in the way it had been designed to, was doing the work that bottom land soil does when you let it. It was being what it had always been capable of being before the blocked heart of the drainage system had turned it into something else. The surrounding farms in Harlan County were having a harder August. The creek was at its lowest in living memory. 2 families on the eastern properties had stopped being able to pretend that this year's harvest was going to be sufficient and had begun the arithmetic of how to get through winter. The families who bought their feed from Falk's store were doing it more carefully. The way people buy things when they've started counting. Clara sold grain to none of them yet. She would, when the harvest was in and the numbers were confirmed. She'd already decided that she would sell at fair prices, rather than drought prices. There was a difference, in a year like this, between what the market would bear and what was right. But she hadn't told anyone that yet, because she hadn't done the harvest yet, and you didn't make promises about the harvest before it was in. The math was too tight for generosity she hadn't earned yet, but she thought about it. In the evenings, when she walked the field at the edge of the day and looked at what was growing there, she thought about the 3 families who were going to need grain this winter, and she thought about her father, buying hay in the hard winter of years ago, and charging what he needed rather than what he could have gotten. And she thought about what it meant to be the person in a county who had grain when others didn't. She thought about all of it, and then she went back and did the arithmetic again to make sure the numbers still worked. They did, barely, but they did. On August 28th, the corn in the northwest section was still shorter than the rest. Still, but only just. The gap was closing. The plants that had stalled when the laterals were blocked had been working, since the laterals were fixed, to recover the lost time, and they were doing it with the specific determination of organisms that have been given what they needed, right at the edge of when it could still make a difference. Clara walked Copper through those rows on August 28th. The mare moved steadily. No stops, no planted feet. The careful, deliberate gait that was always Copper's gait, the gait of an animal that tested before it trusted. But moving through the northwest section the way she'd moved through it on July 28th, the morning they'd found out the ground was ready, trusting, not blindly, not without testing. But trusting what she found when she tested, Clara put her hand on Copper's neck and didn't say anything. She woke before 4 on September 1st, not from anxiety, from clarity, the specific wakefulness of a body that has finished processing something overnight and is ready to proceed. She'd learned the difference between the two over the past 3 months. Anxiety woke you into the arithmetic. Clarity woke you past it, into the sequence of what came next. She dressed in the dark, made coffee she didn't taste, went out to the barn. The horses heard her coming and moved to the fence. 20 of them. 20 animals that nobody had wanted in June, that she'd collected from Hester Malloy and Thomas Greer and Joe Aldenhoff, and a travel-worn man who'd tied a gray horse outside Falk's store and walked away from it, in the sense that people walk away from things they've decided they can't carry anymore. 20 horses, some older, some difficult, 2 with heeled legs that moved differently from sound legs. Copper was at the back of the group, head low, grazing in the pre-dawn with the particular contentment of an animal who has found in an unexpected place ground it can trust. Clara fed them, said nothing. There was nothing yet that needed saying. Silas arrived at 5 exactly, which meant he'd been awake since 3, the same as her, doing what he did before work that mattered. Tobias behind him, James behind Tobias. At 5:15, Orrin Falk's wagon pulled up to the east gate, and behind it a second wagon, which she hadn't asked for, and 4 men instead of the 3 she'd requested. She looked at the extra wagon. Looked at Falk. I said 3 men, she said. I brought 4. The extra one works for me and owes me money, and this is how he's paying it back. He climbed down from the wagon bench with the careful movements of a man whose knees had strong opinions about mornings. Also my wife made. Don't say biscuits. He looked slightly offended. Cornbread. She looked at the 4 men. All from town. All people who had heard, at various points in the past 3 months, whatever version of the story about her in the West Field was current that week. All of them here on September the 1st with wagons and a willingness to work. Silas will show you the rows, she said. Start from the north end and work south. Don't take any ear that isn't fully set. I'd rather have fewer good ears than more bad ones. And be careful with the stalks. The rows are tight. They went to work. By mid-morning, she knew. The northwest section, the stopped section, the blocked lateral section. The section that had been her largest worry from the moment she mapped those largest stakes, and from the moment 11 stakes in July, had responded better than the arithmetic had given her grounds to hope. The ears were smaller than the south section. The stalks were shorter. The yield per acre was going to be lower than the healthy sections. But the ears had filled. The 6 days between the last lateral coming online and the day she'd done her final arithmetic had been enough. Not to make up for the entire time the water had been wrong, but enough to push those ears across the threshold between inadequate and real corn. Measurable corn, corn with market value. She stood in the middle of the northwest section and picked an ear from the stalk she'd watched stop growing on August 17th. Turned it in her hands, not impressive. Smaller than her fist. Lighter than what she was harvesting from the south section 50 yards away. But there, it had done what it could with what it had been given. Late, partial, imperfect, and it had done it anyway. She stood there holding it for a moment longer than she needed to. Huan, knowing she was probably reading too much into an ear of corn, and also knowing that her father would have read exactly the same things into it, would have held it in his hands on a September morning 30 years from now, and known what it had taken to get here. That felt like enough. Mrs. Voss, James, coming down the road toward her with the particular look of a young man, carrying information he's uncertain how to deliver. "There's a man at the east fence," he said. "He's been there a while." Aldous Merritt was at the east fence on his gray gelding. He was 2 days early. The deadline was September the 1st, and this was September the 1st, and he was here. But the money wasn't in his desk yet. The receipts weren't in her pocket yet, and he had no business being here, while the harvest was still in progress. She walked to the fence, kept her pace even. He watched her come. When she reached him, he looked at her hands, corn silk stained, dirty, at her work clothes, and then past her at the wagons being loaded, at the scale of what was happening, at the evidence of what 100 acres of properly drained bottomland could produce in a drought year. "I came to assess," he said. "The deadline is September the 1st, she said. "I'm aware of when the deadline is." He kept looking at the wagons. "I wanted to see the field condition before we meet. To understand what I'll be assessing when you come in." She watched him. He was different from the man who'd sat behind his desk in June and talked about sympathy and valued customers and the regrettable state of the ranch accounts. The composure was still there, the professional surface, the controlled face. But something underneath the composure was working in a way it hadn't been working in June. The specific effort of a man maintaining a position he can feel shifting. "What do you see?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I see a corn crop on the west field," he said, finally. "Which I would not have believed possible when you came into my office in June, but you believe it now. I believe what I can see." He looked at her directly. "What is your projected yield?" She told him the number, watched his face while the arithmetic happened behind his eyes. The same arithmetic she'd been running for months. Now running through his banker's calculation, arriving at the same answer. "That assumes drought pricing holds," he said. "It will hold. 3 families in this county are going to need to buy grain this winter. You know as well as I do what the surrounding farms are producing this year. The price holds the full silence of a man whose calculation has completed and arrived somewhere he hadn't planned to arrive. If you deliver full payment of the note on September the 1st, he said slowly, the bank will of course clear the lien. I know what the terms are, Mr. Merritt." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he reached up and touched the brim of his hat, not the banker's gesture. Something earlier than that, something more genuine. "Good day, Mrs. Voss," he said. He rode away. Clara stood at the fence for a moment after he left. He turned back to the field. "Keep working," she said. Everyone got back to it. The first wagon left for the granary at 10:30. Falk drove it himself. He climbed up onto the bench and took the reins and said, to no one in particular and to the horse specifically, "Want to make sure it gets there right," which was his way of saying he wanted to be part of this in a specific way that he hadn't found other words for. Clara let him go, the second wagon at 1, the third at 3. By the time the sun was dropping toward the horizon, The north half of the west field had been harvested, and the granary in town was fuller than it had been at the end of August in any recent year. Walt Heater, the granary operator, told Falk when Falk drove the first wagon in. Falk told Clara that evening when he brought the wagon back. She was sitting on the porch steps with her boots off and her feet carrying 12 hours of standing. Walt says he hasn't seen numbers like that from this county. In 15 years, Falk said. Bottom land, Clara said. It's been building up organic material for 30 years while everyone called it worthless. 30 years of worthless is a lot of corn if you let it drain. Falk stood by his wagon, didn't leave. Something working in him that he hadn't finished working out. My father used to say that land was patient. He said finally that it would wait as long as it needed to wait for the right person. Clara looked at him. She had revised her understanding of Orrin Falk several times in the past 3 months. Each revision had made him smaller in one way and larger in another, until she'd arrived at what she thought was the truth of him, a limited man with an honest core, which was more than could be said for several people she'd known who had started from the opposite configuration.
Your father was right,
she said. Falk nodded, got up on his wagon, drove away. The second day of harvest finished the south section, the morning of The morning of September 3rd, Clara was at the kitchen table at Forning with the final numbers written on clean paper. Complete accounting. Yield totals from the granary, price per bushel at current drought market rates. The exact figure she was bringing to First Harlan Bank. Everything in order. Everything documented. She had been waiting 2 days for the granary's final tally, the moisture tests, the official weight calculations, the receipt that Walt Heater needed to produce before she could walk into any bank with numbers that would hold up to scrutiny. The granary's process was thorough and couldn't be rushed, and she'd known this and planned for it. Building the 2 days into her timeline without telling anyone she was doing so. The receipt had arrived yesterday evening. She was ready. She was reaching for her coat when she heard hooves, fast hooves. The specific rhythm of someone riding with urgency. She opened the door. Tobias. His face had the white around the edges quality of someone who has just received news they don't know how to carry. There's been a problem at the granary, he said. She felt the floor of her stomach drop away. What kind of problem? Water. The roof? He stopped. Started again. There's a section of the granary roof that's been weak since spring. Last night's wind. It opened up. Some of the grain. He stopped again. Looking at her the way people look at someone when they're about to say the worst part. Uncle Orrin's there. He says to come. She was on her horse in 4 minutes. Walt Heater met her at the granary door, 60 years old. 23 years of running the Harlan County Granary, which was long enough to accumulate the specific expression of a man, confronted with a failure of the thing he was supposed to keep functioning. Mrs. Voss, he said. I am sorry. I should have had that roof section repaired in June, and I didn't, and I... Show me, she said. The damage was in the northwest corner of the granary. Of course it was. She stood in the wet smell of damaged grain and looked at the northwest corner of Walt Heater's granary and thought, with a kind of dark internal humor that surprised her, that northwest corners had developed a specific and personal grievance against her this summer. What's the adjusted number, she said. No, Walt did the calculation. Pencil on paper. She watched his pencil move. The number was $12 short of what she needed to cover the full banknote, $12. She had crossed beyond 3 months of impossible and nearly certain, and was standing $12 short of the finish line. On the morning she was supposed to walk into Merritt's office and set the money on his desk, the silence in the granary was the kind that has texture. The silence of people standing around a number that doesn't quite reach. Then Orrin Falk said, I've got $12. Clara turned. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim. His expression was not the expression of a man doing something generous. It was the expression of a man settling a debt he'd been carrying, counting what he owed against what he had in his pocket. The names, he said. When you came into my store in June, I gave you the names and I laughed about it after. I told Arlen Briggs, and I told Cecil Pruitt, and I made sure the county knew what I thought about it. He stopped turning the hat. $12. I've got it right here. Clara looked at him. The man who had laughed in June. The man who had come with fence posts and biscuits and grow and tile specifications from Laramie. The man who had driven the first wagon himself and brought 4 men instead of 3. The man standing in a wet granary at 6 in the morning with $12 and his hat in his hands. That's a loan, she said, not a gift. I'll pay you back before winter. I know you will, he said. He said it the way you say something, when the question was never really in doubt. She took the $12. She rode to the bank. Merritt was already at his desk when she arrived, which told her he'd been there before 8, which told her he'd been running the same arithmetic she had. His clerk stepped aside. She walked directly to his office. Knocked once. Opened without waiting. He looked up. She set the accounting on his desk. All of it. The granary records, the delivery receipts, the yield figures with the moisture discount from the damage section noted and explained. The price per bushel at current drought market rates. The total. She set the money beside the accounting. Then she set Orrin Falk's $12 on top. Merritt looked at the money, looked at the accounting. Read it. Actually read it, which took 5 minutes, and she stood and waited, because she wanted him to read every number and understand what each one represented when he finished. He looked up. This is the full amount, he said. It is, plus additional. The additional is for next quarter's interest paid in advance, she said. So there's no question about where we stand going forward. Something was happening in his expression. The recalibration of a man who had been operating on an assessment that had turned out to be wrong, and was adjusting. The Westfield, he said. The drainage system. Is it permanent? The main junction is reset and running. The laterals are clear. Properly maintained, that system will run for decades. The field is viable long-term. It's the best bottom land in Harlan County, she said. It always was. He looked at the accounting one more time. Not reviewing the numbers, he had the numbers. Looking at what the numbers represented. He set it down, pulled a receipt form from his drawer, filled it in his careful banker's hand, signed it, stamped it, pushed it across the desk. The lien is cleared, he said. Voss Ranch is debt-free as of this morning. Clara took the receipt, let it dry before she folded it. One more thing, Merritt said. She looked up. The Alderman property, north of your east fence. It came to the bank in May when the widow couldn't sustain it after her husband died. We've been holding it. He paused. Given the demonstrated productivity of bottom land in this area, the bank would be interested in discussing a development note if you were interested in expanding your operation. Clara stood very still. This was the man who had stood over her excavation in July and measured her probable failure. This was the man who had kept a Transwestern envelope in his desk drawer for 3 months. And he was now, from behind his polished desk, suggesting might want to borrow money to expand. She kept her face even. I'll think about it, she said. She walked out into the September morning, bright and sharp and cooler than August. The way September arrives in Wyoming, decided, without ceremony. Like someone who has made up their mind, she stood on the boardwalk with the receipt in her hand. Falk was sitting on the bench outside his store across the street, which was not where he usually sat at 8 in the morning. He lifted his chin. The question that doesn't need words. She held up the receipt. From across the street, he looked at it. He nodded once. Then he went inside Clara, stood there a moment longer. Aware of other eyes, Cecil Pruitt from the dry goods store, 2 women she knew from church. The awareness of being watched in a moment that was being recorded by the town, by the ongoing revision of the story that Harlan County told about her. She folded the receipt, put it in her coat pocket next to her father's journal, untied her horse, put her foot in the stirrup, swung up and sat straight, the way August Voss had taught her to sit. Not performing it, not making a statement of it. Just sitting. The way he'd shown her upright, the back of someone who had somewhere to be and knew how to get there. She rode home. The Westfield was visible from the road. The south section, last of the rows, still standing. The remaining corn waiting for the harvest to reach it, tall and dark green in the September light. Improbable and real on land that the county had written off for 30 years. She pulled up at the field gate, sat there for a moment, just looking. 20 horses, in the south pasture to her left. Petra at the front, dark bay and steady, ears forward, watching Clara, with the focused attention she'd had since the first morning at Mrs. Malloy's fence. The other horses behind her in the hierarchy they'd negotiated among themselves over 3 months of shared work. Not watching, Clara, grazing. Head low, moving slowly through the grass with the particular contentment of an animal who has found. Unexpectedly, after a long time in uncertain places, ground that holds, Clara watched her for a long time. Then she opened the gate and rode in. The horses parted to let her through. She rode to the edge of the west field and stopped. And she sat there, with the September sun on her back and the corn standing in the dark earth her father had always known was there. Underneath 30 years of wrong water and wrong patience, and the accumulated weight of everyone else's certainty that it was dead. It had not been dead. It had been waiting. She reached into her coat pocket, took out the journal, took out the pencil she kept clipped to the back cover, opened to the last written page. Her father's handwriting, ending mid-thought, the way August Voss had ended, with his boots still on, in October, and 30 years of this field unfinished, and 3 lines that were not a record of failure, but instructions for whoever came next. She found the first blank line below his words. She wrote, Voss Ranch, Westfield, open September 1879. Water running clean, copper standing free, debt cleared, land paid. She closed the journal. The corn moved in the light morning wind. A sound like paper, like something being turned over, like the beginning of a conversation. Petra made a sound behind her. Not impatience, just presence. The specific sound of a horse reminding you that there is still work to do, and that work and rest are not opposites but partners, and that the point of finishing one thing is always to be ready for the next. I know, Clara said. She put the journal back in her pocket. The harvest wasn't finished yet. She turned her horse and rode back to it. 3 weeks later, a woman came to the gate. Clara saw her from the far end of the field, where she'd been checking the drainage outfall at Stone Bend to make sure the flow was still steady after the first real rain of September, dark-haired. Hands that showed outdoor work, standing at the gate with the posture of someone who has prepared what to say and is standing, at the edge of saying it. Clara, the walk meter, Mrs. Voss. The woman looked up, the adjustment, the recalibration, the settling into looking at someone taller than she'd expected even though she'd been told. My name is Winifred Causey. I have 60 acres east of town. It floods every spring. Has done since 1872. Every man I've talked to says it's low ground and I should sell it or give up on it. Clara looked at her. Does it flood, she said, or does it not drain after the flood? Winifred Causey blinked. What's the difference? A significant one. Fluting is water coming in. Not draining is water that came in and can't get out. Those are different problems with different solutions. The woman looked at her with an expression Clara recognized. Because she had won it herself, standing at the edge of the Westfield in June, with her father's journal in her pocket, a bank deadline, and 20 horses nobody had wanted, and a county that had already decided how the story ended. The expression of someone standing at the edge of something that might be possible, that they haven't yet let themselves fully believe. Because believing and being wrong is worse than not believing at all. Come, next week, Clara said more gently. We'll walk your field together. Do you have any records your husband left? Notes, sketches, anything about the land? Yes, Winifred said, but no one's ever asked to read them. I'll read them. Clara said. Winifred Causey exhaled slowly, carefully. The exhale of someone who has been holding something heavier than they knew and has just been offered a place to set it down. Next week, she said. Next week. Clara confirmed. She watched the woman walk back down the road toward town. Then she turned back to the field. Copper was at the fence, not grazing now, watching. Those steady gray eyes on Clara, the same direct attention she'd had since the day outside Falk's store, when she'd lifted her head and looked at a woman who was taller than most people and hadn't flinched from it, just paid attention. The way Copper had always paid attention. Clara put her hand on the mare's nose. "More work," she said. Copper blinked, turned her head forward. Riddity. The Westfield finished its harvest on September 9th. No ceremony. No moment that announced itself as the final row. Clara simply worked the last row, the way she'd worked every row, steadily, from one end to the other, and then there was no next row, and that was how it ended. The way most real things end, not with a signal, but with an absence. The work simply not being there anymore when you reached for it. She stood at the south end of the field with an empty harvest basket, and the September sun halfway down the sky, and looked back at 100 acres of cut corn stalks standing in dark earth. Silas, would have said something here if he'd been there. But she'd sent him home the week before with his wages and the extra she'd insisted on paying, and he'd taken it without arguing, which meant he understood it was right. She said it to herself instead. It's done, not loud, not as a declaration, just the statement of a fact that had taken 3 months and 30 years to become true. The Westfield had been waiting. The water had been given a direction. The horses nobody had wanted had become the animals that made it possible. And Clara Voss, who had been told her whole life to make herself smaller, who had spent 30 years ducking through doors and sittings in doors that didn't fit and learning to take up less space than her body required, had crawled into an underground shaft barely wide enough for her shoulders because her shoulders were exactly the right width for that particular problem. Not despite what she was, because of it. She fed the horses that evening, in the last of the September light, going down the line of them with the easy familiarity of someone who knows each animal's particular way of taking grain from a hand. Petra gentle and deliberate. The Greer geldings still opinionated but manageable now. Months of consistent handling, having given them a different relationship with the world. The Aldenhof animals, with their careful, deliberate gaits, each step a decision, Copper last. The gray mare took the grain from her palm, and then stood for a moment with her head close to Clara's, the warm breath of a horse that has eaten and is content. "Good work," Clara told her. Copper's ear flicked. Then she turned and walked back to the pasture, the crooked hind leg visible in the last light, the gait that had made her worthless, to everyone who had looked at her before June, visible and also irrelevant, because what the crooked leg gave her was the knowledge to do exactly what had needed to be done, and she had done it, and the field had been opened, and the water was running clean. Clara stood at the fence until the light was gone. Then she went inside, made supper, sat at the kitchen table, with her father's journal open to the page where her own handwriting appeared below his. Westfield opened September 1879. Water running clean. Copper standing free. Debt cleared. Land paid. She read it once. Then she turned ahead to the next blank page, picked up the pencil, wrote at the top, "Winifred Causey, east of town, 60 acres. Next week. Silas will walk it." She set the pencil down. Outside the window, the Westfield was dark, and the drainage was running, and the earth below it had finally been given permission to do what it had always known how to do. The work wasn't finished. It was never going to be finished. That, her father's journal had been telling her all along, was not the same as being failed. It was the same as being passed along, from one set of hands to the next, each person taking up where the last one left off, doing what they could with the time they had, leaving instructions for whoever came after. She closed the journal. She went to sleep. And in the morning, she got up and went back to work, the way she always had, the way she always would.